Let me know when you're ready. Good evening and welcome to the second in a series of fiscal year 24 budget hearings hosted by the Boston School Committee and Superintendent Mary Skipper. We'll begin with the Pledge of Allegiance. I'll ask all of my colleagues to unmute and join me. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States
of America,
and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Because this is a remote meeting, I will ask Ms. Sullivan to please call the roll.
Thank you, Chair. Dr. Alkins? Mr. Cadet Hernandez?
Present.
Ms. Lopera?
Present.
Mr. Mehta?
Present.
Ms. Polanco Garcia?
Present.
Thank you. Mr. Tran? Mr. O'Neill? Ms. Robinson?
Present. Sorry,
Welcome,
myself.
thank you.
Present.
Ms. Robinson?
Present.
Thank you. We have a quorum.
Thank you, Ms. Sullivan. Tonight's session is being shared live on Zoom. It will be rebroadcast on Boston City TV and posted on the school committee's webpage and on YouTube. The recording will be available in all of the BPS languages. Tonight's hearing documents are posted on the committee's webpage, bostonpublicsschools.org/school-committee under the March 1st meeting link. The documents have been translated into all of the major BPS languages. Any translations that are not ready prior to the start of the meeting will be posted as soon as they are finalized. The committee is pleased to be offering live simultaneous interpretation in Spanish, Haitian Creole, Cabovariano, Cantonese, Mandarin, Vietnamese, and American Sign Language. The interpretation feature has been activated. Click the globe icon at the bottom of your screen to select your language preference. I'd like to remind everyone to speak at a slower pace to assist our interpreters. Thank you to everyone who signed up for public comment. Sign up for public comment closed today at 4:30 p.m. Please make sure that you are signed into Zoom under the same name you used to sign up for public comment. You can use the Zoom tools to rename yourself so that the committee staff will be able to recognize you when it comes time to call on you. Thank you for your cooperation. Before we get started with the budget presentation, I want to ask the superintendent if, in addition to the update she will provide on the DESE data audit, she could update us on two important budget items that have recently been reported on, given our budget presentation this evening. One, the letter from the Inspector General's office regarding what will be a significant budget expenditure, which is the school bus transportation contract. And two, yesterday's media reports about the federal court order that requires BPS to consult with the plaintiff's attorney about the Title I budget. Turning it over to you, Superintendent.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and good evening, everyone. Hope you had a nice vacation. Before I dive into the details of the data audit, I'm going to just spend a little bit of time, to the Chair's point, to talk about the Inspector General's letter that I know you all received, as well as an article that was published in a media outlet about Meta. So in terms of the bus contract in the Inspector General's letter, as a reminder, our bus contract was awarded through a competitive bidding process. And there were multiple months and weeks of detailed conversations about what would go into the next contract. With each contract, we had a chance to assess what went well, and we talked about what needed improvement, and we placed a great deal of focus on performance metrics and accountability. And that was also held up in the Council of Great City Schools recommendations, that was one of the things that really needed to be built into the future contracts. We believe that this contract introduces new financial incentives for improved performance, as well as consequential damages for non-performance. And this is important to make sure that we can hold the vendor accountable and tie financial outcomes to student-oriented outcomes, such as on-time performance. You all received the letter yesterday from the Inspector General's office, and the letter was regarding BPS's procurement for this particular school bus vendor contract. Over the past few months, we've engaged in very productive conversations with the IGO, and I've been part of that. In the letter, the Inspector General acknowledges that BPS is moving forward with the contract and offers suggestions for improved contract administration going forward. We're grateful for the collaboration and engagement that the office has provided. We look forward to future conversations and partnership with them as they advise, and we look forward to bringing the contract forward at our next school committee meeting, which will be on March 15th. In terms of Meta, which there was an article yesterday by a media outlet, and Meta, just as a reminder, stands for Multicultural Education, Training, and Advocacy. This dates back from, that BPS is required back to 1994 from an order stemming from a federal lawsuit to consult with the plaintiff's attorneys regarding how we spend our annual Title I budget. I want to clarify for the school committee that BPS has complied and continues to comply with the consultation terms of the amended order. On June 16th of 2022, BPS provided the plaintiff's attorneys with the proposed Title I budget for the school year 22-23. And that budget detailed the department and school budgets for Title I funds, and it invited the plaintiff's attorneys to submit their feedback on the budget. BPS also provided the plaintiff's counsel with the January 15 status report as required by the order. With respect to the overall BPS budget, BPS, as it has in the past, will review Title I checklists from schools to determine needed Title I services. In addition, BPS will also send plaintiff's counsel the Title I checklists from school year 22 that each school fills out to demonstrate the expenditure of Title I funds in the coming weeks to assist in consultation. Consistent with years prior, BPS will share with the plaintiff's attorneys its proposed school year 24 Title I budget plan, as well as individual school Title I budget plans for consultation when those proposed budget plans are finalized in the spring. The Title I budget consultation process timeline with the Meta attorneys for school year 24 is consistent with prior years, and it adheres to the terms of the order. As you know, the school committee votes on the Title I budget in the fall. With respect to the media reports about the plaintiff's attorney's request to speak directly to the committee regarding the budget consultation process, which is under the order, attorney communications regarding the terms of the order are required to go through the legal advisor's office. This has been a long-standing practice which has been in place for the past 4 decades to ensure representation of all parties consistent with the rules of professional conduct for attorneys. We have every intention of staying true to the practice going forward and to making sure that we're adhering to the order. This is all exceptionally important to us and to the integrity of our BPS legal affairs. In terms of the data audit, Lastly, I want to provide an update on what was released. This was a review of BPS data systems that came as a requirement of the Systemic Improvement Plan, the SIP, with DESE. DESE hired Ernst & Young, which we refer to as EY and was referred to as such in the report. And the team from EY spent the past 6 months reviewing 7 data domains and evaluating them for risk in the BPS. As a reminder, the 7 areas were student program participation, including special education and multilingual learner programming, student enrollment and exit, student discipline, student restraints, morning on-time bus performance, parental complaints, and student assignment. For each of these areas, EY, Ernst & Young, reviewed data from the school year 21-22, so last year. For the withdrawal data, they looked at records dating back 2017 to 2021. The review included interviews with central office, school staff, DESE staff, review of DESE and BPS provided data, and a review of state and district level policy documents. So it was very comprehensive. I had the chance to meet with EY and DESE together as a team regarding the findings, and I really appreciate their partnership. We found it very informative. We welcomed the feedback. Our team was there as well. Welcome the feedback and the opportunity that it gives us to be able to strengthen our data systems and address any of the issues of concern. There's 4 areas that I actually want to talk a little bit about from the report and share some of the work that's already underway. The first is around withdrawals. EY identified these two areas are kind of the greatest risk. So if you remember in the report, they categorized them greatest to least. And so these are the kind of the top 2. So the first was around withdrawals. And in that particular area of documentation, this is something the district's been working on since last spring. And it's also something that, frankly, when I was a network soup for the high schools, I worked on back in 2012. So I'm very familiar with it. And when I came in, it was one of the first areas I asked about because I wanted to make sure that we were putting the right guardrails in place on it. In August of 2022, the district updated relative to the withdrawals, its training, entry, monitoring, validating, and reporting of the withdrawal data to DESE with our school leaders and any of the staff who would be responsible at the school level withdrawing and enrolling students. The district also took a step to form an internal student withdrawal working group, and that group created a process memo for school leaders, guidance counselors, school secretaries, because they're all involved in the process to support the appropriate withdrawal process for students in grades 9 to 12. The students withdrawal group is made up of members in our central office, the Office of Data and Accountability, the Office of Information and Instructional Technology, Risk Management Office, the Office of Budget and Finance. The team meets weekly and met weekly through the fall, and it now meets bi-weekly as systems and structures have been put into place as a further check and balance to make sure that our schools are clear on the process and are following the process that's laid out in the memo. The district's also committed to perform quarterly internal audits of both withdrawal data and restraint data, starting immediately. The internal withdrawal data audits have already begun, with the first audit having been completed this month. And the good news here is that we've seen good progress from the training and calibration. In the first audit, there was 775 student records, and we found that 70% of the student records had sufficient documentation on the first review. So that was a big uptake from when the initial audit was done. We also, since then, have gone back and worked to an 80% compliancy to correct the additional mistakes. Central office, continues to follow up with the individual schools for student records, make sure missing documentation is added or created. And the percentage of records continues to climb, which I think shows that the system of check and balance we've put in place is working. Additional follow-up will be conducted, and any records that still do not have sufficient documentation will have those withdrawal codes changed to reflect a dropout code. And that's an important point. If there's not sufficient documentation for withdrawal, the code gets changed to a dropout. We recognize, therefore, as we continue to improve the integrity of the withdrawal documentation, we change the codes back to dropout for those students that don't have appropriate documentation, we will see likely an increase in the dropout rate and a decrease in the graduation rate until the systems are fully functioning and our re-engagement and support efforts have taken hold. So that will likely be over the next year to two. Similarly, a similar training and audit process is being launched for the restraint data this spring. Is the major finding there relative to restraint data was related to completeness and accuracy of reporting to DESE. Internal audits will focus on ensuring that all restraints are accurately reported in both the internal BPS system, which is our student information system, and the DESE reporting system. And very similarly, there will be checks and balances at each level within special education and within the networks. The other two areas of the data audit were, which fell below in terms of the red and the yellows per se system, were that I just want to give a brief touch on, was around special education IEP, timing and overdue, nature and transportation. These were found to be in the moderate risk, or what they kind of deemed the yellow category of risk in the report. The finding in special education is focused on the percent of IEPs that are overdue. And I want to clarify that when an IEP is overdue, it means that the students are still getting their services. It doesn't mean that those services have stopped. They continue to get their services in line with their last accepted IEP. However, as a result of the findings, we've taken 3 steps around the percent of overdue IEPs. So the first is we're planning a training for central staff, in particular our school soups for the regions and the staff in the Office of Special Education on how to use the centrally created compliance dashboard, and that will happen this spring. And that's to be able to better monitor and understand IEPs as they become coded as overdue. Secondly, we've enacted quarterly data reviews with school soups and special education assistant directors, because they're part of the networks, to review compliance metrics within that particular region to ensure supports and accountability are employed. So as a quick step, they will immediately see what's overdue, and they'll begin to work in their individual regions with those school leaders at those schools to figure out how to get those IEP current. And then lastly, not that this is all we're doing, but this is what we've taken up to do now, is the incorporation of special education compliance data into our district's performance management framework. And this is a framework that's under development in partnership with DESE and the Center for Assessment as part of our SIP. So that will be our way of holding ourselves accountable in this area. In regards to the yellow area of transportation, the major finding was related to missing GPS arrival data. And that's data that's not captured when calculating on-time performance. So if the GPS is incomplete, we get marked as that bus was late, regardless of whether it was or wasn't. It's still marked as late. BPS uncovering the missing GPS data was an issue that the district realized even prior to the audit. And we proactively notified DESE once we became aware of the issue. And that was in the late summer and fall. And we have since been in regular communication with DESE on this issue as we attempt to employ different solutions to solve it. Just to give example, missing GPS data, arrival data, it can occur for a number of reasons, right? It can recur because there's a mechanical issue with the GPS unit and it malfunctions. It can result from data capture challenges, such as like when a bus is dropping off outside of the catchment area of a school, or the route being covered by a different bus as a replacement bus doesn't get entered correctly into the data system. And it can also occur if a bus runs the route correctly, but there's no students riding that day, and so the bus doesn't actually need to report to the school, so it never triggers the catchment area. It also can be like we had 75 new buses added into the fleet, and they didn't have GPS systems installed yet, so there was a period of time of lag with the data. So although there's significant work left to do on it, particularly around making sure that we're tracking ridership, so we know if a bus isn't picking up any students. We've already made a considerable amount of progress reducing the amount of the missing GPS data for arrival. The district does a variety of things. It does a monthly data quality review on the GPS data to reconcile across the systems. The district anticipates that it will continue to be a small percentage of routes missing GPS data due to the GPS units that experience issues day to day. Again, that can be mechanical. And buses, and sometimes that's also because buses don't need to report to the school because they don't actually have a rider on it. But nonetheless, we will continue to work to further resolve these issues. We also have hired additional analytics staff to support transportation data reporting. The team's going to be creating monitoring reports to really be proactive and identify buses that are not reporting GPS data so that we can go back and figure out with that particular bus what's going on. We're also partnering with TransDev in all of these efforts, and they've committed to working with BPS to ensure we are capturing data for all trips and taking on financial responsibility within the performance measures in the new vendor contract relative to this as well. And I think you'll see that in the contract that we bring forward March 15th. So just in closing, my reflections, I think I said this to the chair and the vice chair, reading the data audit was a humbling experience. When I came back to BPS 5 months ago, I knew there'd be hard realities, that as a district we had to face. But we can't fix them unless we know what they are. And for too long in Boston and actually I think in broadly in urban education, we sometimes put band-aids on problems that really are about larger systemic issues. And over the decades here, it's in elsewhere, it's made it worse. And I think today we find ourselves facing those hard realities, many of them at one time, because of this deferred truth. This data audit, and I think I've said this publicly a number of times, but in addition to this data audit, the Council of Great City Schools reports on special ed and transportation and school safety, as well as the other findings in the SIP, they help us to better understand what our challenges are and what those possible solutions are. And this is our charge. This is, I know this committee has said time and again, this is our charge. This is what we want to get right, systemically, and make sure that outcomes for students are what we are focused on. Some of this work, we are clearly able to put some solutions in place in a quick or moderate pace. And then there's others that are going to take longer, sometimes years, because of the systems being entwined. And I think it can feel overwhelming. But we're going to break this into manageable solutions. We're going to continue to be transparent and to work with integrity. And we're going to really push to create the kind of systemic shifts that need to happen in our schools and districts to get this right. I know I'm committed to setting, the standards and implementing the policies that are going to help us to serve our students and our families effectively, to work with our staff to ensure the checks and balances that the reports call out for, that we're doing those, and that we create, eventually our own monitoring and our own accountability systems, in addition to the external ones that we have, and that we welcome. We need in this process multiple BPS voices and departments at the table, to execute a lot of this work, because it is complex and it does cut across departments. And if we do that and we do that effectively together, we'll be able to really impact all of these data domains that the report calls out. And always in my world as a school leader, and certainly as a network soup and as a soup, data drives the dialogue, right? It's very important that we have the means to review the information, to strategically assess, how it informs us, and use those as guides for how we make and take on the systemic improvements that are required in the district, and especially in ours. So as a response to this report, the district will begin, as it already has, to focus on data governance of operational systems across the org. Data governance is, it's what we refer to when we say it's kind of the process of managing the availability, the usability, the integrity, the security of the data, based on data standards and practices and policies. And data governance means that we have to set those internal standards, right? Those data policies, some of which we'll need to bring to you as the policy body, that apply to how the data is gathered, how it's stored, how it's processed, so we can ensure its integrity. I think, tonight's central budget hearing, which is why we're here, comes at a perfect time for us to think about how we structure the existing resources we have and invest in new areas to support this critical work. This budget represents a new beginning and a movement towards systemic and organizational change. And that's at all levels, short, medium, and long term. The district, I think, is leveraging heavily the recently formed regional structure model to provide that kind of level of oversight, monitoring, and accountability, which has been missing in many of these areas, specifically, with the school soups and the operations leaders leading that work. Additional investments are being made, as you'll see tonight, in the regional structure, and that makes sure that we have the kinds of supports and sufficient support for each region across operations and instructional areas. We're also launching Office of Compliance and Risk Management. We're committed to continuing the work with independent external audit organizations, all of which together will help to make sure that we have the appropriate internal audit processes and that they're implemented with fidelity. I think, additional financial investments that we'll see within the budget are being made around data infrastructure, robust, technical systems so that we bring things to a level for a district our size. And these will place and enable us around increasing our capacity for oversight and monitoring. And that also includes the development of data quality reports, which we can do frequently to monitor completeness and accuracy. So this area of data is one that is timely in the audit. It is one that we and I certainly have recognized coming in that we need a great deal to work on and invest in and develop out. And so you're just going to be hearing much more about that, not only tonight, but in the future. Tonight we're going to dive a bit more into detail about the central budget. But what I want everyone to understand is this is, when we talk about systems change, this is the time for the change. We have all the reports, we have the information. Now it's time for us to do that action and that the actual follow through with them, so that, you know, we're setting up a system in BPS that is for the long term, and it's sustainable, and it will stand the test of time beyond change of leadership. You know, I think what we've seen with all what we've seen with all of the flux of leadership is that the systems have suffered and kind of come and gone. And yet what we need for a district of 49,000 students and all the staff we have are systems that are not people dependent. They are systems that the community and you can rely on beyond any persons, or governance structure. My promise to you, is it always has been, is my promise to the children and the families of Boston. It's that my team, and I say team because this is not one person's work, but my team and I will bring that sense of urgency every day, and that we'll make the changes that we need to ensure that every child in every classroom in every school has the same opportunity to achieve the greatness that we want for them. And how we measure that will be in the student outcomes, not in words. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions, Chair, and my team is poised to as well, relative to what I've discussed.
Thank you, Superintendent. And before I open it up to questions from the committee, I wanted to share a few of my own reflections on the data audit. I've been a member of this committee since 2014. And while much of the information in this audit and the other reports we received as part of the systemic improvement plan have not been surprising, they have been humbly and quite honestly frustrating. It's well past time for the adults in this city and in this system to put children first. We're here, we're all here for them. This is my motivation every single day and why I continue to serve on this committee, to make a difference for children. I'm grateful for your ending comments, Superintendent. We must bring urgency to this work, and we must stop putting Band-Aids on these problems and fix the systemic issues. I know some of this work won't be felt immediately, but we must act immediately. I know you've gotten here only 5 short months ago and didn't create these problems, but you are now our leader, and who, in partnership with this committee, the mayor, city council, family, staff, students, and every resident of Boston, must fix them. We're asking you to do a lot, for our kids need it, and they deserve nothing but less. For all of the students, the education we provide sets them on a path for the rest of their lives. This is an enormous responsibility, and we must all rise to the occasion. Every single adult in this district and in this city has a responsibility and a role to play in the success of our children's future. We know this work will take some significant investments, and we are grateful to the mayor and the city for recognizing that with the $50 million to do inclusion right and $2 billion for our infrastructure. Systemic and sustainable changes take that culture shift you referenced, Superintendent, and I don't want to be here a year from now saying the same thing. Count me in. We know the problems. It's time to roll up our sleeves and do the work. Thank you. I'll now open it up to questions from the committee. Mr. Cardet Hernandez.
Thank you so much for the report, and Chair, thank you for your words too. I have sort of 3 groups of questions, so I'm going to just, and I hope I don't do 3 rounds, but I'm going to go with one set now, and maybe my my colleagues will ask the other ones, and if not, I'll circle back. I guess I'll start with the data questions first, and just one, thank you for your honesty and the honest reflection. You know, I'm one of the newer members on the committee, and I remember having the conversation specifically around our graduation rate data at previous times where, you know, we were sort of told there's nothing to see here. And so to have a really sober conversation with you that there is something to see here and there's something to do here as well, only increases our mutual trust with one another, but I think allows people who are watching to see that both things can be true. Like there can be a problem that we're willing to own, and we can be driving a solution at the same time.
That's right.
To sort of start us off, the audits are incredibly helpful, particularly external audits, during a time of assessment and also during the transitional time of action. And I'm curious, and what I would love to see, so there's a sort of leading element here, but like, are we willing to keep doing external annual auditing in these areas while we're still building the internal infrastructure to be able to self-audit appropriately and accurately?
Yes, so through the chair, 100%. I think it's two things. One, we want to be able to audit toward the end of this year and over the summer as to the progress we've made, putting the systems in place, and then doing our own internal audit, and then getting feedback on that. So that's like a good example with EY. We kind of watched the process that they used. We then sort of have done our own internal. We now are putting some other things in place, and then we will continue now at least 2 more times to do that same audit. And then have them be able to come in and look and see what we did and give us feedback on that. Very similar with the Council of Great City Schools or any of the reports, is that we want to be able not only to mark the progress, but to not just check it off like we completed this step, but more importantly, how do we know that that had the impact we were looking for it to have? Because there could be also that in some of these reports, there's other things that just didn't get reported, right? Like that when we go back and look at it, we say, oh, one of the other things we need to do is this, or we unearth that in our process of correction. So, I think really we're talking like 3 years worth of really following this to get this down. That's my experience of how long it really kind of takes from a systems change standpoint of beginning the change, enacting it, feedback, continuous improvement, boom, to the point where you are much more able to ride the bike.
That makes sense. And I will just offer, a year ago, I'm thinking about the graduation data specifically, which I pressed a lot around. A year ago, we were told it was accurate and we don't have concerns. And so there is like a trust, and this predates you. And so I'm honoring that, but it doesn't predate the entire organization or the team. And so there is a sort of trust deficit that currently exists, in which I love the idea of consistent evaluation around the system and the implementation of the system, but there is a little bit of like fact checking our own data that I think will be important to build long-term trust, to have this conversation maybe for a few years, right? Where we're being really sober around, they found X and we found Y and there was alignment, and here's where there's misalignment. And now we know continuous places for system improvement. And maybe we're saying the same thing, but I think, it will be good.
Yeah, no, I think we are saying the same thing.
The second question I have was around the individualized education plans. And I hear what you're saying, that like services don't commence as a result of an IEP, an annualized plan not being reevaluated on time. But it is like saying, I was supposed to move on from the 4th grade to the 5th grade. The admissions team didn't make that transfer, and I'm staying in 4th grade, don't worry, nothing to see here, but I'm not getting the services in 5th grade that I need. And that's the nature of the IEP process. As you talked about the system improvement, and when I think it was like a quarter of our IEPs are delayed.
Yeah,
30%. That's for me a major concern. And as a parent would be a major concern, as a school leader would be a major concern. I'm sure for you as a superintendent, as you named, as a major concern. You talked about pulling new triggers that would, through the dashboard, that would like notify schools more consistently around the late IEPs process, as well as possibly, this is me making an assumption, but like you have an IEP that's coming, make sure you're on time.
Mm-hmm.
Curious if part of that system, like on time isn't good enough, because we also want high quality IEPs.
Sure, yes.
And so is there a system in place that you're putting in, because I've heard this from other families, to also make sure that the IEP is not just started on time, but the testing and the data that's needed to make really informed decisions around student needs is actually being conducted on time, that's different than just the IEP has been started in the system or finalized. That's about like a focus on knowing how the kid is performing, where their growth zones are and where their opportunities still exist, and being aligned around a timeline for schools to be moving with urgency around having that information.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think, so there's like two things. So one is, I think, we clearly need to work to have no IEPs overdue, right? That is the goal. I think one is, in this case, it wasn't a case where the system wasn't smart enough to notify. It was what was happening once the notification came, right? So I think the part we're building in on the risk piece, right, is to try to minimize that by having more opportunities for people to see that, to respond to it, and to try to figure out what's going on. I think at the other level that we're working with EY is to categorize what might be some of the reasons why we're seeing IEPs overdue. So for instance, are we seeing, again, I'm hypothesizing, but are we seeing that there is, for our multilingual learners with disabilities, that there is a concentration who are overdue because there wasn't enough interpretation services, right? That would be like a hypothesis, right? So we're also looking with them to say, what's the big trend piece that we as a district could put more resource toward to eliminate that? I think, to your point, the idea isn't that that it being overdue is the trigger, but this is a process, right? It's sort of like a student going through student support. You want the referral to sort of happen and everything happen timely so that you can deliver what needs to be delivered at that time. So that is something that within the IP system, it is that is possible. And I think one of the things we're working on with in the networks and the special education assistant directors is to be able to look at the margins of like what is overdue, right? So I think in the same way we're thinking along the same lines. It's like, we don't want this to be the line of or like the line that triggers it. We want to make sure we're current at each step of the process.
Yeah, compliance, I always say this, like compliance
the
is
minimum.
it's not the ceiling.
Minimum. That's right.
And so a late IEP is a problem, but it's just like one problem. And probably if a quarter of our IEPs are late, I would argue probably a predictor of other problems around quality IEPs and around quality information that's informing an IEP. Because a late IEP, like anytime all of us are late in our lives, means we start rushing. Yeah. Versus the sort of work happening from a central team to like make sure folks are doing the work that leads up to an on-time IEP versus doing the work to close out an IEP.
Yes.
So the last question I have in this category, and it may connect to another question later, is just around the on-time bus performance piece here. As we're about to move into further conversations about this contract, if I have the number correct, it's like, 25%, I'm looking, 25% of the sort of data that we need isn't included in the data that we have. And to understand how to get a better transportation system, like we need that data. There may be a million reasons. It may be data with no new news, but it like matters for us to have a proper baseline in order to do appropriate planning. As you're holding two things, a contract that you want to present to us for vote, and information that you're missing about 25% of the data that would help us understand quality in a much more nuanced way, as well as a system that I think we all agree is ballooning and expensive, and we don't even have sort of accurate information on ridership. And I think, as I've said in this space too, like we've all seen empty or near empty buses moving across the city. Like, how do you reconcile the data issues with the need for a 5-year contract at this moment?
Yeah. So I'm on the data piece, I just want Director Rosenberg to come on for a minute, Rosengard, Dan, just because he'll know. I think it's actually the missing or the inaccurate GPS was like 7.5 is what it was reported up last month. I think, we have to be able to get our students, like the bicycle is moving, right? And so our system doesn't stop with transportation. So we have to be able to get our kids from point A to point B all year round. I think one of the things the contracts have lacked, including the contract we're currently in,
is being able to actually hold vendors accountable for the outcome, for the performance, whether that is the on-time performance, or whether that is, you know, the number of missed routes, or whether that is, in this particular case, missing GPS or inaccurate GPS data. So I think one big piece that we're very happy with about this contract, and the reason we got consultants to help create it and give, you know, kind of look at national survey, it's why we looked at the Council of Great City Schools recommendations, was that without that in the contract, we would be where we are now, which is only us being able to do what we can do from an accountability standpoint, and not fully. So I think that is why we're excited about the contract, because it represents a fundamental change. It's also one that, from a due diligence standpoint, we spent months and months on, you know, back in the spring prior to me, but months and months did the committee spend on it, working to make sure that that the consultants who specialize in this were advising and being able to tell us nationally, looking at our system, what were the main things for us to get to the performance levels we were looking for. What did we need to do from a contract standpoint? So I think these are the things that we kind of bring to where we are right now in that process. I think our work with IGO has been to even strengthen it more, which is great, because I think that we've benefited from that, having those conversations, including some of those recommendations. Dan, I don't know if you have anything specific on Member Cadet Hernandez's question about the 25%.
Yeah. So I thank you for the question, and Superintendent, did a great job covering this. The 25% is when EY looked at data from last year. They picked out a few specific weeks throughout the year, and when they looked at those weeks, they saw that 25% of scheduled trips had not been included in last year's on-time performance. For when we discovered this issue and reported it to the state in early September, we quickly jumped in on it. And so for this school year, September through January are the months we've reported so far. The percent of missing data has been between 5.3 was the low and 7.7 was the high. So we've made significant improvements from where we were with the data from last year that EY was looking at, and TransDev has committed to working with us to get that number down the rest of the way.
Copy. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Alkins?
Thank you for the report. I think my question, which is rather simple, is that the report sort of outlines the creation of many data dashboards to track this. And so I'm sort of wondering about the timeline of the development of these data dashboards, because it's great that we're having these conversations, but until we actually have a comprehensive system in place to even measure it, we're kind of sitting ducks right now, so to speak. So I'm curious about that.
Yeah, so actually, Monica, I'm just going to bring Monica in because it's also helpful that she was the former director of ODA. But this is clearly a focus area for us, and I would say it's also not just the data systems, but it's also the technology that supports the data systems. So, a good example on ridership, right, is us being able to have tablets to be able to determine who's riding the buses, right? Minus that technology, everything's done manually, which is time consuming and lends itself for human error. So what has to be kind of backed up in the data system creation is also the technology as input and how we actually capture it and get it in there. So we're working kind of on both fronts right now. But Monica, do you want to just speak a little bit on the data side?
Sure. So one of some ongoing work that is happening, part of the way that the Office of Data and Accountability and our IT department are utilizing some of our ESSER funds is around the creation of a new data warehouse that is aligned to the EdFi data standard. This work is allowing us to sort of standardize the way data flows from various systems into a central data warehouse that will allow us to build some of these more comprehensive data dashboards.
Slow down.
Sorry. That work started this past spring and is ongoing through the fall, and has begun, the team has begun developing different dashboards using that data warehouse. They're also using other tools that are currently available to us to create dashboards for different areas, and are continuing to sort of think about how we streamline all of this into one place and build dashboards for specific items. So I think one piece that's interesting to think about is that with the withdrawal data, in order to determine if the documentation that is uploaded is sufficient, it does require manual review of that documentation. And so thinking about how do we ensure that we have the human resources to be able to do that review and are then tracking that information that we can view in a dashboard is part of the work that our student withdrawal working group is doing when they meet on a bi-weekly basis.
Thank you. Are there other questions? I'll go to Mr. O'Neill and then back to Mr. Cardet Hernandez.
Thank you. I just want to comment, and it's interesting, Superintendent, your opening comments, or your closing comments, I should say, as part of your opening talk, are about, you know, looking in the totality of the reports that have been received. And so the you know, agreement with DESE, the work that they have done, the council reports, the EY data audit, and even now the Inspector General's comments, I think very helpful comments, quite frankly, about the potential transportation contract. I appreciate your closing comments because it is about looking at all these issues. We can't improve until we're honest and transparent about where they are, and echoing the comments that were made before, the appreciation of the honesty and looking at our issues and our problems. And we don't have trust right now with our families and our communities. So we have to be transparent. I think the next key steps are, now that we've looked at all these things, what is your strategy about how you're going to tackle them, particularly where they cross over, right? And a lot of our special ed and our transportation, our ELL and our transportation, our special ed and our ELL, there's a lot of intersections here if we look at it. So how you're going to tackle it systemically, and then what are going to be the touch points that you're willing to set up, that we want to set up as a board working with you, of how we're going to be looking at this regularly to see if there is improvement along and actually following through. That is
right.
The only way we can rebuild trust with our families, is by was acknowledging the issues, and we're doing that, but now what is the plan and how are we going to track it and how are we going to adjust if we're not reaching it? So
yeah.
I think it is actually interesting that tonight, the reason for this meeting is to talk about the central budget, right? Because a lot of these, and maybe I'm foreshadowing questions that I'm going to ask later on. We don't have to answer them now, but I am going to be interested to see, how have you learned from these reports, and what are we doing to plan in the budget, the central budget, for increased data? What are our systems? Do we have the right people? Do we need more people? Do we need more professional development for our school leaders of how data is input? But are our systems right? And are they talking to each other? What are we doing about school safety? What are we doing about transportation as far as the investments in this budget that we're going to be talking about tonight? So I'm fine asking those later on.
Yep.
But I think the issues that you raised tie so well to a discussion about our central budgets.
Yeah, I appreciate, through you, Chair, I appreciate kind of the thinking on this, because I think in some cases there's a sense of urgency, clearly. But sometimes when you have a sense of urgency, you can make rash decision, and you don't think thoughtfully and strategically about how things connect and the impact. And I think this is one of those one of those moments in BPS, right, where for this year is our year of input with all of this data and recommendations, and then a beginning of laying out, how to rebuild the foundation in a way that each year we build onto a foundation that is stronger and stronger and stronger to make it sustainable. To try to do everything at one time will not work, given the depth of the issues that the reports have shown. So we have to be strategic in starting in the biggest lever areas and making sure we're coordinated in them, making sure that organizationally we have accountability built in at each level of the organization. And I think our step to the regional networks is a big one, because it takes us from 119 schools where a lot of different things can be happening to 9 regions with a coordinated team and oversight that really can see and respond more nimbly when we see things not work. And it allows us to work backward in building the systems and the structures to support those 9 regions in an adequate way, which clearly hasn't happened over decades. So, it's one of those like once in a lifetime kind of opportunities, as difficult as all of this is to look at, especially when, many of us have been in the system and it has raised us. But the BPS is a system that our students and families need to be able to count on in generations to come, right? This isn't about just this moment. This is about what is to come in our system. And that's what we have to kind of get to in building to that future. So I feel blessed with this committee to ask those questions and to give the resources and to hold us accountable in a way to make that happen. And that starts with me as the leader, and that starts with my team as leaders. There's no way out of that piece. We have to be able to show the improvement, to show the change, and to have that be for not only in the next couple of years, but more importantly for what's to come in BPS in the decades to come. Because
as the expression goes, Superintendent, I think President Reagan said it about adversaries in the past: trust but verify, right? And so we want our families to do that for us, and we as a committee want to do it with you and your team. We want to trust, but we want to verify. We want to know what are the data points along the way that we know progress is being made, and first, what's the strategy to make it happen? And I think I, as an individual member, hope this committee really thinks hard about, what's a dashboard that we can be looking at to seeing that we're making progress on these systemic issues. Because we can't just say, wait, and all of a sudden it'll be fixed. It's what are the steps along the way, and are we ensuring together that we're making it happen? And is the budget appropriate to make that happen as well, since this is, after all, a budget discussion tonight?
That's right. And to remember to remember that we're riding the bike. And so when you're riding a bike with 49,000 children, you can't stop, take the tires off, and put new tires on. You have to figure out how to make that correction and that change at the same time that you're continuing to serve. So that, I think, is the uniqueness of education. It's why sometimes change happens in a very mishappen way. And that's what I think we have the opportunity to do, thinking together as a team, as a body, and certainly as a city, of how to be able to do that in a more coordinated fashion. So that, to me, is the opportunity on the table that I do feel is a lifetime opportunity for all of us.
Thank you, Superintendent. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Cadet Hernandez.
Thank you. And I just have 2 more sets, one about transportation, one about the Title I conversation that you led. You talked about a lot, Superintendent, so I apologize.
It's all good with me.
Okay, good. I'm curious, I read the Inspector General letter, and I agree with you. They recognize that we plan to proceed, or that the district rather planned to proceed. But I didn't read it and think that there was like unwavering support around that plan to proceed. I also recognize that the contract went out to bid before you got here. And so I guess I'm curious on sort of two levels. You know, if I could wave a magic wand, this is me being really transparent in this room, like I am not in belief that we are ready for a 5-year commitment around a new transportation contract. I just don't think our house is in order. It's like dating before you're divorced. It's like, we've got to figure some things out before we're ready to go into our next serious partnership, even if it's with the same people. And so, you know, I have concerns like, why 5 years, not 1 year? I also know that this started before you got here, and I'm curious how you reflect on that and your alignment to that process. And then I think the sort of second question is just to understand your thinking around this. And I'm thinking of what I understood some of the undertones of the Inspector General letter to say, like, why do we need to take this out to bid? Why is it not part of your strategy to bring in the management of this company in-house? Why isn't it part of our strategy to look at these assets and get rid of them and lease them? I'm talking about buses. Like, sometimes I feel like, and when we've talked about transportation, it's sort of like, there's nothing we can do. Like, this is the system we have. And there's a lot of ways that we can shake it up. Maybe even make a more competitive bid. Like, I suspect it would be much easier to get competitive bids on a process where folks were management and leasing the vehicles or owning the vehicles. And then we wouldn't have the same duplicitous structures that currently exist, right? Where a family calls BPS for information about their bus. They're not talking to TransDev. Like, they're managers, but we are still managing it. I'm just sort of curious, why stick with the status quo for 5 years, even after the Inspector General letter, sort of raising concerns, and not think about some of these other possible solutions that could help us get better service and maybe even have cost savings?
Yeah. So I think one thing coming into this, because it's a budget hearing, was that the legal advisor gave us guidelines on what how in detail we could go in order to still meet open meeting law. And I think some of what you're asking is in the detail piece. And I think it would be appropriate for when we present the contract, but I don't think it's something that unfortunately I can answer right now. What I will say is that I do think that the district did a good job in the spring, recognizing its limitations of knowledge of our transportation system relative to the rest of the nation. It sought out a consultant or consultants to advise, which I think was the right step. And I think from that, we got a great deal of information that was then reinforced with the Council of Great City Schools report. So that's all very consistent. It showed us what we believed, but it confirmed that we are very complex, despite we're not the biggest system. But because of the public-private and charter transportation requirements, and because of our congestion in general in the ecosystem of our city, and because of the year-round calendar of all of our programs and our charter and private partners, we just have a really complex system that the most vendors would not be able to handle. We also believed and knew that part of the issue of not having contractually any performance or penalty for not meeting strict outcomes was really a deficit for us in being able to hold a vendor truly accountable in the ways that we would want. So I think that the process, the comprehensive process the district took, where it landed, and what it put into the bid were kind of all the right things. And I think that's about what I can say on it.
And thank you for that. And I'm sorry for, asking questions that weren't right for this space. And I'll make sure to bring some of those into one of our closed sessions. The last thing I have is just around Title I, and this is a budget question, but it connects to the conversation we were having earlier. The Title I funding is intended to, supplement, not supplant services. And the Globe article that I read named that, from their analysis, it was like, I don't know, I'm looking, the 2023 budget records showed that roughly 6 million of the 42 million for the Title I budget, or 14%, explicitly intended to support English language learners and non-native English speakers, was below what we were required to spend. I'm curious if, one, you believe that that's accurate, and then two, how are we solving that for the future?
Sure. So I'm going to actually ask CFO Cooter to come on that one, because he would have more specifics on the actual numbers.
Hi, good evening, everyone. For the Title I, the supplement not supplant standards and the meta article, as I understand it, and I have to be honest, I wasn't reading too closely in the article details, but the meta requirements has a certain percentage of our budget that's to be spent on English learners. And there's two ways that for the district-wide sort of central office spending, we consider English learner spending. The first is that the amount of the budget that is specifically and explicitly set aside for English learners only, multilingual learners only. Though that would be the portion of the budget that was in a program code or account. This signals that it's English learner spending. I believe that's the amount that they had reported. The other piece is that for district-wide programs, we report on the participation of English learners in those programs. For instance, if we have a summer school program that is funded on Title I, and students participate in that are English learners, that can be part of the sort of proportion. So it is separate in, from the supplement not supplant piece, the percentage requirements or our requirements for spending on low income programs like Title I, but it is a different requirement under Meta.
But we're like, you don't have any concerns around underspending, specifically targeting supports for English language learners, non-native English speakers?
No, I mean, I think this is something that we monitor very closely and have partnerships with the Office of English Learners between my office and their office to be able to work with schools in terms of the set aside for English learners, and then also to develop programs for English learners through Title I. That's all part of the process. I think we have a robust process for monitoring it and are in compliance with our external requirements.
Okay, thank you. And I'm asking, one, because of the sort of broader sort of news around this, and also the way that it's being presented to us externally, like it seems like a concern. So maybe it's just, even as we're in this budget process, this is not my area of expertise, but it may just be something for us as a committee to be sort of focused on. Because, sometimes where there's smoke, there's fire. And so I just want to be sober about that, and also make sure that we're spending money in the way that it's intended to be spent, and that it's being deployed to the young people who need it the most.
Thank you. Thank you. Are there any other questions before we move on? Okay, thank you all. The committee looks forward clearly to future updates on all of this critical work. We'll now transition now to our focus here for the evening, the fiscal 24 budget. On February 1st, Superintendent Skipper presented her preliminary fiscal 24 year budget proposals in the amount of $1.4 billion. Last week, the committee held a budget hearing where we took a deep dive into school budgets. And tonight, the committee will take a closer look at the central budget. In a moment, we'll invite Chief Financial Officer Nate Cooter and his Deputy Chief Financial Officer David Bloom to share their presentation. First, I would like to invite the superintendent to give opening remarks.
Thank you, Chair. And as I've said, I'm excited to share our central office budget presentation with you tonight. The central office, exists to serve our schools. I think I've said that from day one. This is a large and complex district with students who have a variety of different needs. And it's our responsibility as central office to ensure that each student has what they need to succeed and reach that potential. As we've seen over the past few months, there's a lot of work to do. And as we've talked about tonight, in partnership with the state, as part of our systemic improvement plan, we're working on ensuring our transformation schools have the resources that they need to support students and dramatically improve student outcomes. Reviewing and implementing systems changes to better track and report our data as a result of the EY audit. We've received reports from the Council of Great City Schools relative to, lots of recommendations on school safety and transportation and special education. And our team has also laid out a strategic plan for our multilingual learners, and in partnership with the city, have launched the Green New Deal for BPS and are finalizing over the next year several critical assessment reports, the facilities condition assessment, the school design study, and a facilities master plan. So lots of inputs for us to consider. I do think that all of these efforts have helped us, and certainly me, to get a better understanding of just the depth of challenge we face. And as I said, opportunity. And so we have to act. All of this work is large in terms of the scope of it, in the sense of urgency of it. Doing this well is going to require us to look at, kind of open underneath the hood and look at every aspect of the work through an equity lens. In this year's budget, we're ensuring that our equity work is a through line, not only within the regional models, but also across the entire organization. We also have to look at the current structure of the central office so we can focus our work on these priorities. And it also requires for us to look at what we might need more to invest in both people and resources at the district level, so we can create the systems changes that we've talked about and have those systems changes be sustainable. As I said earlier tonight, for too long in Boston, and certainly I've lived this, throughout my career here as well. And I think also just more broadly in urban ed, we don't want to continue to band-aid the problems. I'm committed to setting the standards, the policies, the practices that, they're going to help us to serve our students and our families, and make sure that we're accountable in the work. And we can't continue to do the same thing and expect different results. We are here in service to our students and our families, and especially to our Black and Brown students, to our special education students, to our multilingual learners, because they historically have been underserved in our district. And, I think the opportunity agenda is the only way we can and will support, going forward in a proper way. I also know that there's been a lot of instability in our district over the last 7 years, really since Dr. Johnson. And, I know that people have kind of heard, some of what we're saying tonight in a variety of ways. And because of that, there's a lack, there's definitely a lack of trust. And, I just want to reiterate that I'm really committed to leading the work. My team is really committed to executing this vision. And we are committed together to building back trust and making sure that student outcomes improve across the district at every level. Some of this will happen more slowly than any of us would want, but it has to all be through openness and transparency. And most importantly, which is how I've spent my career, doing what we say that we're going to do and making sure we can show the results to back that up. And that's what we're here to do. So, I just I also, I've listened to the Secretary of Education, Pat Tutwiler, who former Boston person that I've had a lot of opportunity to work with. And, you know, he talked about stabilizing and healing through the pandemic and then transforming. And this is really just stuck for me because I think it really does capture kind of how we have to approach things. And I think it's possible. And I think, you know, we can do better. We're working hard on the, you know, certainly on the stabilizing and the healing, and the call to action is in the transforming. You know, we need to get small things right because they matter. And we need to continue to really dream big and vision and think of the things in it from an innovation standpoint that are going to make the difference and the change in our systems. But we need to get those small things right. They do matter. And I know for myself, I can't do this work by myself. I need you as a committee. I need our mayor, I need our city council, and most importantly, I need our BPS team in our schools and in our district. And, you know, it requires the leadership team, you know, that you're going to see tonight in the presentation. You're going to hear from them, especially my 3 deputies. You know, you're going to hear that this really is going to require all of us to raise this work and to do it and to make difficult decisions that are student-centered, not adult-centered, at each step of the way. And, you know, I know the mayor is committed, her administration is committed, they work in partnership with us, committed in every step, not only in the resources, you know, $50 million to help us get inclusion right, $2 billion, you know, in the Green New Deal, but, you know, also just committed in all of the smaller ways to making sure that our schools are the places that our kids deserve to be. And I know that our community, right, it takes a village. And many of our students, we know they're not well right now. You know, they're not doing well right now. They need us, you know, they need us to do the hard work for them. They need us to show up for them. They need us to set high expectations and give high levels of support to them. And they need to know that we believe in them and that we're going to be willing to make those hard decisions. As unpopular sometimes as those hard decisions will be. In tonight's central budget presentation, we're going to share some of how we're structuring the central office to focus on the 6 priority areas of investment. And, you know, we're also going to show on the central office how we're aiming to take work and burden off of the schools and the school communities, because they're, you know, they need to be there and showing up for the kids on a daily basis. And my leadership team knows, I've said this really clearly, that we need to shift the way that we've been doing things. We need to hold ourselves accountable. We need to think systemically and sustainably. And most importantly, we need to think about our students as the centerpiece and the focus of our decision making. And they are embracing that, and they are working their butts off to accomplish it. And so tonight is a step in this direction with the central presentation. So with that, I thank you, and I will turn it over to our CFO, Nate Hooter.
Thank you so much, Superintendent. Good evening, Chairperson Robinson and members of the school committee. As Superintendent mentioned, my name is Nate Cooter. I'm the Chief Financial Officer, and happy to be back in front of you to discuss the FY24 budget for the Boston Public Schools. We are proposing an FY24 general fund budget of $1.439 billion, a $65 million increase above the current FY23 budget to support the children of Boston. We believe this budget will strengthen our schools and bring our vision for equity into reality. As the superintendent mentioned, tonight's presentation is on the central office budgets and how we fund and organize the district to support students in schools. We know that success lives in the classroom, and it's our job as members of the district team to remove barriers and provide high quality supports to our teachers, school-based staff, and most importantly, to our students. As we did for other budget presentations, we open tonight with this statement from the Opportunity and Achievement Gap Policy. Throughout tonight's presentation, we will continue to reference two major themes, which the superintendent has emphasized throughout this planning process. The first is that each of our investments must be designed to close opportunity and achievement gaps for our most marginalized students, including Black and Latinx students, students with disabilities, and our multilingual learners. The second theme is community and family engagement. We must continue to partner with our community to ensure that we are responsive to their experiences and expectations for their students. It's also important that we align to the school committee's own strategic plan presented in April of 2021. And we share it here because it was also an anchor to it was an anchoring point, the start of our planning process. Throughout the presentation this evening, you'll notice consistency between this committee's goals and the superintendent's investment priorities. For those of you who are coming to your first FY24 budget hearing tonight, we wanted to provide you with an overall investment summary. The changes in our budget from FY23 to this proposal can be broken down into three main categories: strategic investments, increased costs, and long-term sustainability. Tonight, we'll discuss the central office strategic investments and overall cost increases. I wanted to take some time to explain some budget basics. Online, we've posted our budget organized in several ways, including a table that breaks down the budget proposed by department. This table includes a list of each school and their budget allocation, and each central department and their allocation. You'll find this table broken into two groups, central and schools. But this tells you who's responsible for managing the funding. It's not helpful for understanding where you'll find those services. So we further break out our central category in the budget, not based on the department responsible for spending, but by the purpose of those services. This includes school services budgeted centrally, those items in the central budget, but actually the services that are found in our schools. Central administration, which includes the superintendent, the central academics team, and other central operational supports. And finally, non-BPS student services. Those services, like transportation to charter schools, are provided to non-BPS students, Boston-based students in non-BPS schools. We ask a lot of our schools and school leaders, and our job in the central office is to take as much of the burden off of them as possible. The list on the left includes examples of what we consider school services budgeted centrally. Custodians, occupational therapists, and related service providers work directly in our schools. And from a student's perspective, it's no different from a classroom teacher. But for management reasons, these are items that is not on the school budget versus the classroom teachers, which are found on the school budget. Regardless, we also want to be really clear about the administration costs of the district. So the list on the right provides example of what that includes. Some of it includes what most people think, the superintendent, the finance team, and human capital. But it also includes the management and supervision for many school services budgeted centrally, like psychologists, social workers, and the oversight of our food service program. Our full budget is available online, and later in the presentation, I provide a link. But if you wanted to familiarize yourself with the budget in one table, this is it. BPS has consistently budgeted around 6% of our overall budget to central administration, and nearly 90% of our budget is directed to schools or provided to schools through school services budgeted centrally. At this point, I'd like to introduce Dr. Sam DePina, our Deputy Superintendent of Operations.
Thank you, Mr. Cooter. Good evening, Madam Chair, members of the school committee, and the BPS community joining us this evening. I'm honored and humbled to be serving in the role as Deputy Superintendent of Operations for the district. The Operations Division is a team of collaborative, student-focused leaders across 6 divisions: the Capital Planning Department, a division, Finance, Human Capital, Safety Services, Student Support. It also includes our traditional operational division made up of our Facilities Department, our Food Nutritional Services, our Technology Department, and our Transportation Department. I'd like to publicly thank all the staff within those departments for the work they do day to day for our students and staff. As I hear myself list the departments within the operation divisions and consider the investments being proposed for FY24, I'd like to publicly thank Superintendent Skipper for establishing the 3 deputy superintendent structure. This structure has already shown the ability for us to closely assess and monitor the work in the central office services provided in support of students in schools. In addition, it has given us the ability to make short and long-term strategic plans and decisions for central departments, allows us the opportunity to assess the impact on our work and investments while increasing the accountability on all of us here at the central office. This increased accountability will be important as we plan for FY24 investments and beyond. Now I'll turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Anna Tavares.
You're muted. And you would think I would know that better, huh? Appreciate that. Thank you, Dr. DePina. Good evening, school committee members. Thank you for the opportunity to share more deeply about the work I am leading, which includes an expansion and a welcome opportunity to lead both the Office of Equity, Strategy, and Opportunity Gaps, as well as the Office of Family and Community Advancement. As you can see, equity, family, and community are leading our critical work. One of the things you heard at the beginning of this presentation, and we hear from the superintendent every day, is how equity and engagement must be a through line across our entire organization and throughout all of our work. The superintendent shared how we are centering our historically marginalized students, our Black and Brown students, our students with disabilities, our multilingual learners, and our students living in poverty across our system, as well as how we're purposefully and thoughtfully engaging with their families and community members to center their voices and address opportunity gaps. Superintendent Skipper also spoke of our investments to the regional model, which I experienced as a former principal in our district. And I also experienced the loss of this structure and can speak directly to the benefits of the regional model and its impact to student outcomes. In terms of benefits, the regional model makes for a crystal clear line of accountability across the board. The relationships between the schools, the support from their school superintendent, and the relationship with central office staff was and is now more streamlined, which means that our students can be supported with more efficiency. Having experienced our work during and post-pandemic, strong structures are more critical now than ever. We need your collective support to further fortify these new structures. Equity drives all of our work, and equity begins with our communities. We simply cannot do this work without the support of our families and community partners, and we must be intentional about emphasizing racial equity in practice and through action in order to address opportunity gaps. Again, in particular for our Black, Latinx, multicultural, and multilingual students and our students in special education. Our goal and commitment is to practice genuine and equitable engagement practices. These are essential to increasing trust within our community while providing us the opportunity to also receive critical input and feedback, thereby creating a true partnership. This goal will take time and commitment. Thank you for listening. I now invite my colleague, Dr. Chen, to share comments.
Good evening, school committee members and the public. Thank you for giving us this opportunity to share the work that we do. I am very privileged to be able to support in this role, leading the academics portfolio alongside a number of very dedicated team members. And I do have the privilege of representing our work this evening and how it aligns to our budget decisions. I want to, in the areas, you'll see that I oversee schools and accountability, teaching and learning, specialized services, and multilingual and multicultural education. And schools are at the center of everything that we do, especially centering the identities of our students, particularly those that are most marginalized, including our Black and Latinx students, our multilingual learners, students with and without disabilities, and our students with disabilities. And one of the ways that we can do this at scale is to ensure that there is coherence and close working amongst these 4 different areas of the work in academics to ensure that our students are able to learn at the highest levels of learning to achieve the greatness within them. And that is the purpose for this portfolio, working in tandem together. As I said, it begins with our schools. And in our schools division, we make sure that we provide the support and supervision for schools. I'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slide. But to really ensure that the conditions for learning are set and that there's instructional leadership support to make sure that our teachers and school leaders get everything that they need to best support our students, especially in the deep work of equitable literacy implementation, which you've heard us talk about several times during the course of this year. We also have our regional support model and our principal pipeline and new leader support work in this area. We also have our supports for various types of schools, autonomous schools, transformation schools, and hub schools, because each of those schools require a different type of support. In schools and accountability, we also have the Office of Data and Accountability that really focuses on assessments, research, program evaluations, and our systems accountability. We also have supports from our secondary and alternative education work, including career tech education. Within teaching and learning, this is where we focus on, we've talked many times about grade level, culturally and linguistically responsive curriculum. The teaching and learning work is centered around that across all content areas: English language arts, math, science, social studies and history, arts, health and wellness, world languages, and also our libraries, which we'll discuss a little bit later. We also focus deeply on our teacher leadership work. We believe deeply in the power of great teachers and how teachers collaborate together to serve and support each other. The last time you saw some of our national board certified teachers, that's just a little bit of a taste of what we have in terms of our teacher leaders, as well as new teacher support. We also focus on early childhood education that includes both the comprehensive supports of curriculum and programmatic implementation, but also we work in tandem with the city and our universal pre-K implementation to ensure that we have early childhood learning access to families across the city. In terms of professional development, we focus on making sure that our students have, our teachers have access and training to high quality instructional materials that are culturally and linguistically responsive. And to ensure, you've heard me say this a couple of times around multi-tiered systems of support, but we want to make sure that our schools have the resources and the training to be able to support our students in differentiated ways in tandem with grade level learning. In this unit is also the Office of Multicultural and Multilingual and Multicultural Education. When you think about the process of our families, they come in through the Welcome Center, and those families who indicate on their home language survey speaking any other language other than English at home, they are then referred to our Newcomer Assessment and Counseling Center, where we provide the assessment of students in terms of their needs for multilingual or English learner needs. And then we work in tandem with our Welcome Center to ensure that they are offered placement options based on their English language development needs. And then our family and community engagement specialists really support in tandem to ensure our families are acclimated and understand the various systems and supports available to them. And then, of course, the instructional support happens through multilingual instructional coaches, working in tandem with teaching and learning. They develop and support curriculum in SEI, ESL, and our bilingual programs. We also continue to support our multilingual learners with disabilities, and you'll see this both in this unit of multilingual and multicultural education, as well as special education or specialized services. We will be adding an additional role specifically around bilingual programming to support our expansion of bilingual programs as evidenced in our own strategic plan. And when you think about all of the compliance, some of which we've discussed this evening, equity and accountability ensures that all of our English learners or multilingual learners receive the types of support they deserve. And they do a lot of the work with our legal offices in coordination with DOJ and the state monitoring systems. Last but not least, we have our special education or specialized services area of work. We've talked much about inclusion. I'll talk a little bit more about additional investments in that area, but that work is incredibly important. Part of that work is also IEP development and support. I think this was mentioned earlier in the evening by one of the school committee members, Cardette Hernandez, around the quality IEPs. We must, of course, meet compliance, but it is really also making sure that the services and instructional areas of support are clearly delineated on the IEPs and with all involved in the learning and instruction and services of our students with disabilities. Of course, we also have compliance in this area and instructional support, early childhood, special education, related services, and behavioral health. On the next slide, I'll go into a little bit more detail about our regional model. Our system needs to be built around both support and accountability. We know that we need to increase partnership between the central office and schools. Our superintendent has made that a clear charge before even beginning officially. In response to this, we've created the regional support model to coordinate central office academic and operational supports dedicated for each of the 9 regions, with the regions being based in geography to best meet the needs of our communities. There's a focus on support for transformation schools and historically marginalized students. The premise behind this structure was to create a balanced community of schools who work together on a common set of district and school-specific priorities, and to do so led by a regional superintendent with the support and partnership of an operational leader. The quality school plans, which you've heard about through our transformation presentations, of every BPS school continues to be a pivotal tool for how we align and coordinate our regional supports. A regional school superintendent and an operational leader, even as talented as they are, and they are, cannot do this work alone, nor can they provide the level of support required for an entire region of schools. Therefore, embedded within each region are liaisons who support a wide range of work across the district with the context of the schools in the region, and most of these supports include equitable literacy coach, accelerated improvement and inquiry manager, district social worker, special education director, assistant director, human capital liaison, budget liaison, supervisor of attendance, and a multilingual compliance and academic supports liaison. As we continue to improve and implement this regional structure, we will measure central office accountability, responsiveness, and effectiveness from school leader feedback and teacher climate survey responses. We have a number of key systems in place to support the regional support model. Regional coordination work that we do with our school superintendents that meet bi-weekly with their regional liaisons. During this time, they coordinate support for schools in their regions centered on each school's quality school plan and progress monitors improvements within the 3 district priorities: instruction, culture and climate, and attendance. We also engage in monthly professional learning communities, or PLCs. I think you've heard me refer to them before. Our regional school superintendents and liaisons plan together and lead monthly professional learning with teachers and principals and liaisons focused on the key district priority of equitable literacy. All of this PD is hosted by a school in the region and uses our classrooms and schools for individual and collective learning. In short, we are looking for evidence and inspecting what we expect to see in terms of literacy practice, which we've heard me talk about grade level texts and tasks specifically. Our chief of schools and schools division visits 3 days a week, working side by side with the regional school superintendents and liaisons. And they together make observations in the classrooms. When we talk about the implementation of equitable literacy, it is really being able to go into the classrooms, working side by side and supporting and giving feedback to our school leaders and teachers. Our Office of Transformation, School Support, and Leadership Development also spend regular time observing and supporting schools and their leaders by region. I'll now turn the time back to our CFO, Nate Cooter.
Thank you so much. The superintendent has already highlighted a number of reports and key analysis and audits that we're doing as a district. This provides us with a variety of key resources for us to develop our strategic planning over the next few years. What you'll find in the 6 priorities that the superintendent has outlined for her budget this year is direct alignment to those reports, the systemic improvement plan of DESE and the Council of Great City Schools that came from that original SIP planning. It also points to our investments point directly to our own strategic plan for multilingual learners, the Green New Deal for BPS, which includes facilities condition assessments, which are forthcoming, and our K-6, 7 to 12 design studies. All of these are anchored to our purpose of ensuring equity and closing opportunity achievement gaps. So this evening, as we talk about our strategic investments, we'll be aligning them to those priorities so that we can talk about how that will directly align to closing opportunity achievement gaps. To start us off in talking about the inclusion investment, I'll turn it back over to Dr. Linda Chen.
Thank you. We are very grateful to the city and the mayor for ensuring that there is funding to support our efforts in inclusive education, something that every one of our students deserves across the city. We also are thankful for our partnership with the Boston Teachers Union to really work together in tandem to ensure that we have system-wide inclusive education to ensure every student's success across every school, which means that every school would have the ability to offer a full continuum of services in ensuring least restrictive environments for all of our students so that we are fully inclusive. This year, we've engaged in work in this first planning year with a cohort of elementary and K-8 schools, as well as supporting high schools, specifically in 9th grade in their transition. This included a process of professional learning in inclusion planning teams that represented a cross-section of the school community, including the school leader, parent representation, and teacher representation. Part of this funding will go to some of the structural changes for some of these schools who have gone through this inclusion planning team process that results in some additional staffing based on different configurations of inclusive classrooms. So in essence, we are moving from a number of different strands and sub-separate settings that was highlighted in the Council of Great City Schools report to ensuring that we have classrooms that are fully included. So we will move to a place where the district will have fewer substantially separate classrooms and into fully inclusive classrooms of students based on our collective bargaining agreement guidelines with the Boston Teachers Union. This funding will also go to supporting immediately before schools transition from multiple separate, sub-separate strands to inclusive settings, investments in reading and learning specialists, as well as multi-tiered systems of support coordinators to help build a strong foundation to ensure that there are differentiated needs before making structural changes from primarily sub-separate settings student assignments to fully included classrooms. I want to also note on this slide, these are, as the CFO indicated, additional investments of 9.6 million, in addition to the special education's operating budget of 90.7 million. And I just want to note that, as you saw in an earlier slide, the special education department budget includes many direct service providers, such as related services and occupational therapists. And going to the next slide, I'll continue on to our second area around multilingual learners. And our multilingual learners are largely funded through our school-based budgets, which you see here, that roll up to 146 million. Again, this is about the additional investments of $6.3 million that we are making in addition to what the OHM office currently already has as an operating budget of just under $5 million. This will include school planning grants for schools that are looking to transition to expand bilingual programming in their schools. This also includes additional funding for our dual language schools to support the needs that they have in their schools that are specific to dual language programming. We also are adding additional social emotional supports for our multilingual learners with SLIFE social workers to support students specifically in that program because they are very specialized. And it also includes ensuring that our family specialists move to operating funds from ESSER funds because it is a permanent support that we must provide for our multilingual families. We can move on to the next slide, which is details supporting our equitable literacy investments. So much of the equitable literacy strategy and support comes from our teaching and learning department, which has just a little over $6 million as their operating budget, but we are investing an additional 3.5 million that include equitable literacy coaches, reading specialists, librarian staff, and all the resources and materials, including collections that go with our support in libraries as hubs of learning in our schools. With that, I'm going to transition the next slide over to Deputy Dr. DePina to speak more about student supports.
Thank you, Dr. Chen. In addition to the academic investments, including the SLIFE social workers Dr. Chen mentioned earlier, we'll also be investing an additional $1.2 million to support our attendance initiatives in Succeed Boston, restorative practices, in school culture and climate efforts. More specifically, we'll be increasing our capacity to provide attendance support and outreach to students absent from school in a way that is aligned with the regional support model. This investment expands the services at Succeed Boston, including bullying prevention and intervention support, as well as the expansion of restorative practices across the district. Finally, we will also be working with school-based leaders and staff to provide additional support with school culture and climate initiatives. With that, I will turn it over to Dr. Chen.
We're excited to also make additional investments to our secondary students. Again, this is in addition to the funding that's already supporting the Office of School, Secondary Schools and Alternative Education. So I wanted to highlight a couple of investments here. One is ensuring that we have dedicated college staffing at each of the 8 schools with early college. And also the expansion of alternative education programming to support our young people. I think you've heard the superintendent talk over time about the need to make sure that we add additional supports to ensure that we have clear multiple pathways for our students in both academic and career experiences. This also covers additional expenditures for the adoption of the AP African American Studies course. And this will also further support professional learning for our AP teachers to ensure that students have more access to advanced coursework. And with that, I will transition over to Deputy Superintendent Ana Tavares to speak more specifically to family and community engagement.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chen. Some of the ways in which we are really considering our commitments to the investments include also our commitment to the way the structures will be fortified, specifically around both equity and engagement. We have a commitment to the regional model, as was shared earlier, both by the superintendent and by myself, and of course, by my colleagues, in considering how we will create a team that also addresses those specific lanes of support across our schools. One of them in particular on the equity side of the house is considering the equity specialists that will be supporting schools and thinking about the issues that most impact students, families, and communities. And again, on the family engagement side, considering the supports that family engagement specialists will also provide to schools, specifically to school superintendents and school leaders around issues with engaging and practices that are equitable for including the voices of our historically marginalized students and their families. Those are investments that are absolutely at the core of equity and engagement and at the core of Superintendent Skipper's commitment to expanding the supports and the structures that are needed to ensure that student outcomes are always at the center of all that we do and all that we invest in. Thank you so much for the opportunity to share some of those investments that are very particular to the work that we are leading and that we will continue to ask for your support in ensuring that these structures also have the time and the commitment from all of us in order for them to be successful. And I now give an opportunity to Chief Cooter to continue with the presentation.
Thank you so much. A large portion of our budget increases in FY24 are due to higher costs of providing the same services year over year. I pointed this out earlier in the budget hearings that in 2016, BPS completed a long-term financial plan that identified 5 areas driving our budget increases. The first is collective bargaining. The second is the district footprint. The third is transportation. The fourth was student needs, including and especially special education costs. And finally, revenue. As you can see from this slide, 7 years later, we continue to see cost pressures in all of these areas. You'll also notice that we are moving $16.8 million in salary costs to ESSER. This is the portion of the BTU collective bargaining agreement that paid for the inclusion reforms. At this point, I will now turn it over to Dr. DePina to talk about operating costs and facilities.
Thanks again, Chief Cooter. It's well known that costs associated with facilities industries have continued to increase across the country. As a district, we are impacted by those cost increases. We must calibrate to keep up with them. The major areas of facilities cost increases are from the following. First, approximately $8 million in utilities costs associated with our electricity and natural gas. These cost increases stem from renegotiating our previous flat rates, as well as additional air conditioning equipment installed in our schools. Second area of cost increases are from an increase of our environmental services across the district at approximately $1.5 million. We have also seen an increase in equipment maintenance costs, including central HVAC building equipment upkeep, as well as improvements at the cost of about $2.4 million. Finally, we will begin much needed critical painting repairs with an initial investment of $2 million in FY24. Next slide. In addition to the $13.9 million internal BPS operating budget, we will also leverage external grant funding in the city's capital budget for additional facilities investments. These external resources will support with the integration of our indoor air quality system with our building management system, an HVAC grant to start work on design, bid, and construction documents, as well as project execution, radiator covers across the district, technology investments for our reporting in our work order management system, and finally, our water initiative to bring water bottle filling stations at all of our schools. Next slide, please. Consistent with the facilities industry cost increases, the transportation industry is also experiencing cost increases as well. The largest FY24 cost increases associated with our transportation services are with our yellow bus operator, MBTA passes, increased wage costs, and student transitions. Increased yellow bus operator costs are driven by inflation on fuel and maintenance costs, and increased driver wages. We've also experienced cost increases in providing MBTA passes associated with our new 3-year MOU signed in 2022. This MBTA increase in costs with bus passes is also due to a shift in our policy to provide MBTA passes to students with IEPs who also receive yellow bus service. In addition to bus driver cost increases, we've also seen a much needed increase in salary costs for bus monitors. This increase in salary costs are driven by the newly ratified union contract and increases in monitor assignments. The final costs in transportation are due to the increase in the number of rides for students in transition between residences. Thank you. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Chen.
Thank you, Dr. DePina. On this slide, I also wanted to share some increased costs in special education related to specialized services, with the majority of the additional expenditures being in ABA or applied behavioral analysis, staff, as well as related services staff, and also in additional contracted services. So we have continuing needs for additional services for our students with disabilities.
Wanted to take a final slide to talk about the last element of our cost increases, which are increased investments in teacher recruitment, diversity, professional development, and support. One of the things that we've done when we talked about the school-based sustainability is to be able to move things that we thought were critical supports that are currently funded on ESSER onto the general fund. As part of that, we've seen success in several teacher retention and diversity programs and professional development and support for new teachers that we want to move onto the general fund to make sure that this sustain long after ESSER ends. This $750K involves these programs that are currently funded on ESSER and moving in the general fund for next year. Handling other long-term increasing district costs will require an important deliberation by this committee, and you'll have to address big questions regarding the district policies, including the number and configuration of schools. And one of the things that's critical for that discussion is our enrollment projections. So I wanted to take some time this evening and talk about and clear up some misconceptions about our projections process and the methodology and the implications of this process on our schools. These slides were first included in the appendix of the school budget hearing back on the 16th of February, but I think it's worth spending some time building our collective understanding. First, for context, Boston has a number of factors that are unique. And I know we often hear about this, that Boston's special, but there are some factors that make our projection process and our school budget process different from other districts, both within Massachusetts and across the nation. The first is that we're a full choice district. We can't just look at neighborhood demographics and assume that students will stay in the schools in their neighborhood or stay within a single school. We know that kids are moving throughout the district and moving in and out of the district. The second thing is that we have hard class size maximums in our union contract. That means that we don't have the flexibility to target average class size, which is a typical target for large urban districts. We also have specialization of programs that leads to different types of seats and programs, and the number and size of our schools increases the sensitivity to small shifts in enrollment, small shifts in our population. The last two factors mean that we have more specific and smaller targets to hit, rather than larger schools with fewer programs. When we under-project enrollment in any grade, school, or program, this can translate into reduced student access or unfunded costs at the school level. This is why BPS projections are based on the maximum enrollment or the high water mark. You're not going to hear about this in other Massachusetts districts because there are no other weighted student funded districts, and I'm not aware of any other full choice districts. You also won't hear about this in other major districts throughout the country because there are very few full choice weighted student funding districts. And there are even fewer, if any, that have the same collective bargaining restrictions that we're dealing with. At the risk of losing my audience with some pretty technical slides, I was told to come up with a better visual, but I'm not that creative. I wanted to try and walk you through what the high watermark really means for us as a district and why our enrollment projection number that you see in our budget planning is consistently higher by thousands of students. So for these next few slides, I'm going to be using enrollment in school year 21-22. The reason that I'm using that school year is because it's the school year for which we have a full year of enrollment to go through the examples. On this chart and in the next few slides, you'll notice three bars. The first bar, which is gray, here with the number 6,109, represents the number of students we have in special education program seats. The large orange bar, here represented by the number 37,025, represents those students who are in the general education programs and general education program seats. The final bar here represented 6,188 students are multilingual learners who are in multilingual learner SEI seats. Combined, all three of these bars total 49,322 students. That was the total enrollment for our district in October of that school year. Of those three numbers, only general education was at its highest point for the year. At 37,025, that was the most students we see in general education program seats in the Boston Public Schools in the year. A second snapshot taken in February, sort of mid-year, sees that our overall enrollment grew from 49,322 to 49,654. That was the total enrollment, and it was higher than October, but it was not yet the highest point that we'll get for the year. In this case, you see that general education students declined from 37,025 to 36,883. That means that if we used October enrollment as the only basis, we would be providing peak enrollment for general education students and not peak enrollment for any other category of students. Both multilingual learner students and special education enrollment students have still not reached the peak. Finally, if we look to June enrollment, we see that our total district enrollment in that year peaked to 50,012 students. Both multilingual learners, represented again by the blue bar at the bottom, had 6,912 students. That means it had grown by nearly 800 students from what we had seen in October. Many of these students were new to the district throughout the year. In the case of special education seats, we see that it grew from 6,100 in October to 6,379. That is driven a lot by students who are identified for special education early education programs and where we are required to provide them a seat as soon as they turn 3 years old. Final number I want to share is what happens when you combine all three high water mark numbers. That is, we start with the 37,000 number from October, which is represented in the middle here on this bar. We then take the 6,300 students represented as the June enrollment for students in special education, represented here. And then finally, 6,912 students in English learners. Combined, that gives us a projection of 50,000 students, 316, a number that is higher than any total enrollment at any given point. If we consider this funding, this is just by big three categories of students. When you start to think about segmenting students by neighborhood, starting to think about enrollment in individual schools, grade levels, and other specialized programs within special education, you can see why the high watermark leads to higher projections overall than any point in the given year. This is not accidental. This is not meant to sort of prop up enrollment. It's meant to provide us with the right funding number to provide capacity. Not funding to the high watermark amounts to intentional and systemic underfunding of schools who serve our highest need and most vulnerable students. This means that if we don't fund to this capacity, we don't build schools with this capacity, that when students arrive later, some of our most vulnerable and highest need students won't have seats ready for them. They won't have high quality teachers ready to meet them and educate them. And this was an intentional strategy to make sure that we are closing opportunity and achievement gaps. I'd like to give one specific school example to underscore the implications. The Beethoven Ohrenberger is a K-8 school in West Roxbury. As a large K-8, it serves general education students, multilingual learners in an SEI program, and students with emotional impairment in a standalone special education program. In this school year that we covered, the school year 21-22, the Beethoven Ohrenberger's total enrollment started at 943 in October and grew to 972 in June, with SEI and special education program growing and general education program declining. Their emotional impairment program grew by 16 students across all grades between October and June. In October, they had 69 students in the EI program. And in June, they had 85 students. Now, the EI program class size max is 10, which means that if we had built capacity on the October number, which was 69, we would have opened 7 classrooms instead of opening the 9 classrooms that we knew we were going to need. Or the school would have had to fund the capacity for those 9 classrooms. by making cuts to other things in their budget, because they know those 16 students would have translated into $375,000 of additional funding for that school. We also already hold a reserve for enrollment changes that cannot be predicted. But in the example of the Beethoven-Orenburger, this program growth is annual, predictable, and should be planned for in our budget. There are additional slides in the appendix that go into more detail on enrollment overall, but I appreciate the time to be able to walk through this both at the system level and at an individual school level, because it's a critical part for understanding how we prepare our schools to serve the most vulnerable students. With that, I want to point out to everyone who's following along online that you can find more information, including tonight's presentation, weighted student funding, school by school comparisons, and more details about every school budget on our website. And this is the second hearing. There will be another hearing on March 15th, which we will be answering questions from the committee and hearing more public comment before the school committee ultimately takes a vote on our budget on March 22nd. With that, I want to thank all of you, and I'll turn it back over to Chairperson Robinson for your questions.
Yes, thank you all for the presentation. Because this is a budget hearing, I want to pause here for public comment, and then we'll come back and open it up to questions and comments from the committee. We'll now move on to public comment. Ms. Sullivan.
Thank you, Chair. The public comment period is an opportunity for parents, caregivers, students, and other concerned parties to make brief presentations to the school committee on pertinent school issues. Questions on specific school matters are not answered at this time, but are referred to the superintendent for a later response. Questions on specific policy matters are not answered at this time, but may be the subject of later discussion by the committee. We have 4 speakers this evening. Each person will have 3 minutes to speak, and I'll remind you when you have 30 seconds remaining. Those who require interpretation services will receive an additional 2 minutes. Speakers may not reassign their time to others. Large groups addressing the same topic are encouraged to consolidate their remarks or choose a spokesperson to provide testimony. Written testimony is appreciated and encouraged. Please state your name, affiliation, and what neighborhood you're from before you begin. Please direct your comments to the chair and refrain from addressing individual school committee members or district staff. When I call your name, please raise your hand virtually in Zoom, and please make sure you're signed into Zoom with the same name that you used to sign up for public comment. That will allow us to identify you when it's your turn to testify. We'll begin this evening with John Mudd, followed by Roseanne Tung, Dr. Maria Serpa, and Ruby Reyes. If you could please raise your hands virtually in Zoom. Mr. Mudd?
Did you say we had 3 minutes?
Yes.
Okay, my name is John Mudd. As you know, I'm a longtime advocate in Boston. I appreciate you hearing me. I, along with other members of the ELL task force, want to strongly support the superintendent's stated commitment in her budget message to expand access to native language for multilingual learners and multilingual learners with disabilities. As the superintendent says, this is the time for systems change. It's a sign for systems change from the question 2 mandatory English immersion to access to native language allowed under the Look Act. We would like to hear, however, an explanation of how the proposed budget actually supports the expanded access to native language. I would hope that members of the school committee would also ask this question. Unfortunately, what we see in the detail of the budget is nearly exactly the opposite. The largest single expansion for multilingual learners proposed is the hiring of 38 new ESL positions at a cost of $6 million, which would continue the trend we have seen over the past years of moving students from SEI single language classes into general education classes supported by ESL teachers. This is the wrong direction, and we have testified about this many times before. We should be adding SEI language-specific classes. We should be increasing the match between the language of the teacher and the language of the students in those classes if we really believe in expanding access to native language. What is BPS projecting for the enrollment of students in SEI language-specific and in general education classes under this FY24 budget proposal? We haven't seen these figures yet. I want to point out that there are alternatives to hiring the 38 new ESL teachers that would in fact build our capacity and promote expanded access to native language. And this has implications for the central budgets. One, we could invest more in recruiting, hiring, and developing bilingual teachers and paras. Two, we could expand the number of English language development 1 to 3, the low-level students in SEI language-specific classes, and expand the match between the language of teachers and students in those classes. 3, we should ensure that the equitable literacy strategy is adapted well to the needs of multilingual learners. There are many other ideas for alternatives, but I would appreciate it if you could answer these questions. How will the FY24 budget expand access to native language for multilingual learners and multilingual learners with disabilities? 2, what are the enrollment projections that show a need for 38 new ESL staff positions? And 3, aren't there better ways to promote native language with existing and new funding?
Mr. Mudd.
Thank you very much for hearing me.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Roseanne Tung.
Hello. I'm an ELL task force member whose first language is Mandarin, the only language I spoke until I started school. I never had an Asian teacher until I was in college. Having teachers and staff from my culture would have made a huge difference in maintaining my first language and developing a strong racial identity. I'd like more clarity about the budget presented thus far and the actual funds allocated for prioritizing multilingual learner education. For one, besides the $750,000 for dual language expansion out of the $6.3 million for strategic investment in multilingual learners, what other multilingual learner programs are being expanded? We all know that $750,000 cannot come close to funding the launch of even one dual language program. The narrative of the budget is disconnected from the numbers shared. Inclusive education, least restrictive environment, culturally and linguistically responsive curriculum and instruction, multilingual program expansion are professed. But what is the allocation for curriculum in multiple languages, or for increasing the number of bilingual teachers, paras, learning specialists, family liaisons? How much more culturally and linguistically responsive can you be than providing teachers who speak the same language as the students? Before ratifying the budget, we need to ensure that it addresses the opportunity gap that is the shortage of bilingual educators. I would like to see the dollars align with the words, especially with respect to native language literacy. For example, in studying the budget documents that I have access to, under increased costs, I wonder what proportion of the $28.7 million for increased salaries is for bilingual teachers and staff. and in which multilingual learner programs. I ask myself how the relatively small allocation of $700,000 to recruitment, diversity, professional development, and support could possibly result in a systemic solution to create a pipeline to increase the number of bilingual teachers and paras and close the multilingual learner opportunity gap. Budget allocations should be commensurate with the educational needs of the 32% of our students who are multilingual learners, the 39% of our students born in another country, and the 49% who speak a first language other than English. It's ironic that multilingual learners are such an asset to our community, but the budget does not reflect the urgency of meeting their needs through the use of native language in their education. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Tung. Our next speaker is Dr. Maria Serpa. Good evening. Please begin when you're ready.
Okay, ready. Good evening. I am a professor emerit of education and bilingual special education at Pleasant University and a member of the BPS ELL task force. When I arrived in the USA several decades ago with a teaching degree in my native land, I did not understand or spoke English. Indeed, I experienced firsthand the language barriers in learning, much like many of our multilingual students who are at BPS schools in English-only programs. As a bilingual elementary education teacher, as well as a bilingual special ed specialist, I have witnessed how important it is for students who are learning English to have access to their home language. So I'm joining the testimony given by my two esteemed colleagues from the ELL task force, Mr. John Mudd and Dr. Roseanne Tang. I'm focusing on the urgency of access to home language and to oppose the equitable literacy program for our students, because as I understand the program in my review, it does not address the needs of students who are learning English and the budget allocated for them. So point number one, access to home language. We all know that the role of home language in these students' lives is of paramount importance and significance and must not be left to chance. Currently, BPS offers very limited options for these students. We have dual language, a few dual language programs, and some heritage classes. And this is really not sufficient. If I am to frame a continuum of native language access so we could build our budget on it, we need to go from basic to better and to best. And in basic home language access, I would suggest that consideration needs to be given to the performing arts, to storytelling, to games, to dancing, etc. In terms of at the better category, I think that the transition of SEI, language specific, to TBE and world language is critical. And the best, of course, as we all know, dual language programs are the best option for home language access. In terms of equitable literacy, it appears that the program focuses primarily on teaching reading to English as a first language, and that is not what we need for research-based reading for bilingual students or for students learning English. We also know that the current practices are not producing the achievement results in literacy. And literacy is one of the most important things that we must do for our ELLs. So in conclusion, I must say, hiring biliteracy specialists is critical. The time is now to really address their needs because children cannot wait. Their future is now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Serpa. Our next speaker is Ruby Reyes.
My name is Ruby Reyes, and I'm the Executive Director of the Boston Education Justice Alliance. Where are the comprehensive plans developed by central office leadership to ensure that fiscal cliffs and difficult decisions don't fall on school communities? If you are going to identify additional funding sources to replace ESSER, why are they not identified yet? Soft landing funds often serve as the bridge for school communities, yet there are no plans shared as to what those bridge supports will be for school communities. Positions will be moved, but where is the financial planning for ensuring those resources stay in place? When, where, and who holds central office leadership accountable when there is a lack of careful, detailed, and thoughtful planning? We know there are bright spots in BPS, and they are not in central office. Those bright spots are the ones that tend to get cut out of budgets first. There's a huge disconnect between what central office invests in and how those investments make it to schools, classrooms, and families. The Henderson students who protested several weeks ago highlighted this very point as one of their comprehensive demands of addressing a lack of student voice, excessive suspensions, and an investment in cell phone holding devices rather than prioritizing supplies and restorative justice practices. How is the budget season going to ensure that funds make it to classrooms and students rather than what currently is happening, which is threatening fiscal cliffs and difficult decisions and prioritizing the wrong things? In addition, where is the financial commitment and investment in creating a Black student agenda, a system-wide restorative justice practice, a plan, and literacy support such as a reading specialist at every school? The funds for the proposed 18 community connections coordinator positions can be shifted to invest in the restorative justice department, which serves system-wide schools. Currently, there are only 3 full-time people working in the restorative justice department. Funds for positions like the 18 community connections coordinators and the $30 million towards cameras and surveillance can be redirected to that staff department. Those funds were quickly made available for those things, yet the restorative justice department continues to only have 3 staff, and that is not being quickly addressed. Vagueness is not transparent and therefore does not build trust. Thank you.
Thank you. Chair, that concludes our speakers for general public comment.
Thank you, Ms. Sullivan. And I want to thank everyone who spoke tonight. Your input is critical as we consider the superintendent's budget recommendations for the next fiscal year. Now I'll open it up to questions from the committee. Dr. Alkins?
Yes, thank you for the presentation, as well as for the public comments that we just heard. And I think I actually have I think it's best if we actually have somewhat of a breakdown of the larger budget. So when we're talking specifically about multilingual learners, and I noticed it was from, I think, an overall budget of 146 million, it'd be good to even have a breakdown just of that budget of understanding what's going to the creation of bilingual paras and teachers, more specific breakdowns that we heard from our public comments, just so that we have at least a baseline of where we stand before we start even thinking about what's added on to that. But specifically, one question, I'll start there and then I'll come back around, is the 38 positions that comprise the largest investment there for ESL teachers. Is that related, if I remember correctly, from a report that we heard that I think ESL has the largest vacancy in terms of teacher positions as compared to dual language programs in terms of the vacancies. Is that the reasoning behind that? And so I'm just looking for an answer there.
I can take both of those questions. I think the first, we do provide in the detailed budget tables a breakdown of the budget by department, so you can see what is in the English learner department budget. And then there's the program code budget, which breaks down the different categories of English learner programs, bilingual programs. And I think David is pulling up the actual tables, which you can download online as well. So here you can see the program code budget for bilingual / SEI. This is the total budget that you can see across departments, central office departments, and schools where they have explicit general fund coded items to multilingual learners. The thing I'll note from the $146 million number, in some cases, positions may be coded with a bilingual account code, which you can see on the account code table, which includes bilingual teachers. They might have a bilingual program code, or they may be in the Office of Multicultural Multilingual Learners, Central Office Department. Combining those three categories is what gets you the $146 million number. So this is our attempt, and if you have detailed questions about any of the tables or what they mean, I'm happy to walk through them. The other question that you had about the increased number of ESL teachers and its relationship to vacancies. Our budget process looks at the enrollment projections and then develops the number of staffing required to serve those students and assumes that those positions will be filled. There are some cases where we will be staffing up coverage paras or coverage positions, but no, the ESL positions are intended to be filled. And so we don't budget for extra positions in anticipation that our needed positions will be vacant. Because in that case, what we may see is that we would have a whole bunch of vacancies at schools where we need to fill them, but we would have filled swing positions or filled positions at other schools that could be extra capacity. Creates an interesting sort of operational challenge.
So if I'm understanding correctly, at what point do we think about the expansion of programs? And I mean, it seems even from your example that you gave within your presentation, I think the biggest areas that we saw in terms of growth were not necessarily like in general education, but these are also areas where it seems like the projections are also underlining that we should be making more of an investment in perhaps like native language instruction and other programs as well. So I'm trying to reconcile that.
Yeah, I think in terms of the timing of the program expansion, I'll ask Linda to take that on. I will just note from a projections capacity perspective, what we're trying to do is for places where we see a predictable pattern at a school of a high water mark increasing, we put those projections out early. But there's also a reserve that we hold centrally for what we know will be the unpredictable enrollment patterns in places where we need to add positions through our strategic enrollment action team, aptly nicknamed SEAT is the acronym for them, where we know the kids have showed up in other places. But I don't know if Dr. Chen, if you could take on the question of what's the timeline for expansion of new programs and how do we approach that?
So we have committed to expanding 25 bilingual programs in 2 years. And so that is part of the OHM strategic plan. And what we're trying to do is, what's happening is it takes time to expand. And at the same time, we have increasing needs of our greatest need students, that being those that have an English language development level of 1 through 3, and 1 being the highest need. And so we have increased from last year to this coming year projection, 1,000 students. So those are largely in the level 1s. So we have a greater increase of level 1s. So for instance, we're even planning to open up a newcomer center, another one, because we need to serve the support, the needs of the students. And at the same time, I would say another contributing factor, and I couldn't agree more with the speakers that shared, that we need to make sure that we have staff that reflect the language needs of our students. And that is something that we are working very hard to get at. And I agree with what Dr. Serpa also said, it really is by research, the dual language programs and her sort of good and better sort of dynamic there. So what we're trying to do is make sure that we work with schools to at least have SCI language specific schools. And I think some of the speakers mentioned that, because that's also a good on-ramp into whether it's transitional bilingual or dual language programs. Obviously, dual language programs take longer to plan for. But what I would also say, the increase of ESL is also because we have a number of students who have maintained their level at 3. So in terms of the access levels 1 through 5, what we see typically in second language acquisition is it takes longer in those middle levels, like the 3s and 4s. And what we're seeing a trend in right now within BPS is that more students are staying longer at level 3 than in the past. And we think that's also some impact of the pandemic and missed time, if you will. But we're seeing more students remain in 3s than in previous years. And so one of the things that we have in terms of our DOJ requirements also is that students who are 3s cannot be grouped with 1s and 2s for more than a year. So then we have to create new classes for them to separate them from the 1s and 2s. So that's also a contributing factor to the additional needs of ESL teachers. And ESL teachers provide supports for both SEI as well as bilingual programs. So they kind of have a double duty. And so again, what the speakers have shared, that is correct. We want to get to bilingual programs, but in the interim, we also have this increase and what I would term as long-term Ls, meaning that they're staying in that 3 category for much longer than typically they have.
Sorry, just a follow-up. So do you think that it's going to in any way hinder future investments specifically for bilingual programming or anything like that?
I don't, because part of the strategy is one that was shared by one of the speakers, is trying to make sure we convert, if you will, an SCI language specific to a bilingual program. So what's good is we have a lot of those already. And we don't want this additional need that we're seeing to hamper that progress. So what we're also trying to do is expand dual language programs. So even students who are 1s and 2s or transitional bilingual, they can go directly into a bilingual program and not have to go into an SCI language specific first. So we're doing both, the transitioning of those programs and creating new programs.
Thank you.
Thank you. Are there other questions? Ms. O'Neill?
No, I thought I saw Mr. Cardet Hernandez hand
Yes,
up.
yeah. Right, Mr. Cardet Hernandez, and then Mr. O'Neill.
Thank you for the presentation. I will say I found this presentation hard to follow, so I'm just being honest, and I found it hard. I think we're good at giving the good feedback, so I'm like just being very transparent. Like I found it very difficult to understand the what's there tonight. So like I'm walking away without like a lot of clarity around additional headcount and things like that. I think, and maybe it was Dr. Elkins who had brought this up in a previous session, but I know he brought it up this evening. It would be incredibly helpful to not think of the budget process, at least for me, as looking at new spend only, but getting greater clarity around the current spend to like understand how this is working. And that might even be thinking about what are universal programs versus what are at percentages of schools within particular sort of budget categories. I know we can go look at that spreadsheet, but I actually don't think it gives us the universal understanding around priorities as well as the sort of tiered supports that different schools are getting aligned to this budget. So like and it's a hard conversation to have because historically we think of budgets as like more is just better. And I'm thinking about budgets the same way I think about my own personal budget, where it's like more is not always better. It's like spending in the right places on the right things is better. And I am not hearing that in the mix. Like, I'm not sure where we're moving things to get different results. I just am hearing how we're adding things to similar categories given increased demand. And I'm just confused around, I think I'm confused around priorities, but I'm also confused around what is systemically changing during a time where we require systemic change. So I'm naming that. And so this is probably, I have a set of questions, but normally I have them like jotted down based on the presentation. I don't have a lot. I have tons of just notes jotted down, but I don't have tons of coherent ideas because I didn't leave with coherence around the budget and what we're doing. And I doubt that that was intentional, but that's just where I'm at. So I'm just naming that for myself. I don't know if anyone else feels that way or folks who are tuning in tonight feel that way. I think the question, I'll get to a question. And I guess it's specifically, and I don't want to sort of relitigate the complexity of projections. I'm more curious around, I guess, there are reports that there's like a 1-to-11 student teacher ratio given under enrollment at schools, and a sort of under schools with who are at capacity, and a large number of schools who are under capacity with additional space for students to come. And so I guess sort of two questions, and then I have a follow-up question, like, how do we determine when a family is coming into the system where in a choice district, when a school is capped, what schools have more access opportunities, particularly at a time of holding budgets harmless, for families to enter? And is that even part of our enrollment process as we think about targeting families throughout the year to schools that have more available services instead of concentrating students in schools that are already over capacity?
I'm gonna attempt to answer all parts of this, but if I miss some of it, I'll trust you'll ask a follow-up question. The first, in terms of our budget priorities and investments by priority areas, I think we have for each of the different priority areas on the, I can give you the exact slide number. On slide 4, it highlights the investments that are aligned with those strategic priority areas. And so I think the question, just as a follow-up question, if you had what level of detail you're looking for, we can provide that detail to you.
But just, I guess, sorry to cut you off, just to sort of piggyback on that, but then is it fair to assume that the priority areas only have additional investment, not a redeployment of resources from areas that are no longer priorities, or that we've assessed are no longer serving in the way that we had wanted them to or need them to now?
This is the thing that Superintendent Skipper has been asking me about since the first time we met, when she started again here in the fall. this is the last year that we will be doing a primarily roll forward budget with central office departments. I think taking a critical eye to student outcomes and really asking departments to go top to bottom in all of their budgets. I think because of the timing of the transition and the fact that our budget cycle is so early, that a lot of the investments you're seeing here at this point are with new dollars. But this process hasn't started. The superintendents, we're continuing to work with central office departments to find ways to abandon resources. And I think, or not abandon resources, but abandon things that aren't working. And I think in terms of ESSER, there's been a lot of discussion about redeployment of ESSER programs that haven't gotten off the ground, some of which are because of vacancies and some of the issues that you've pointed out where we haven't been able to staff up as quickly as we wanted to. In terms of the enrollment capacity question that you were asking, so when we project to a certain capacity, there are some schools that fill completely in round one. Our most popular schools will completely fill in those early rounds. And oftentimes we have built the capacity at those schools to the maximum that they can fill within their existing buildings. They're very, I can't think of an example. I'm sure there is one that I'm missing because we have so many schools, but schools that could add more students because of demand. If we had the classrooms, we would have opened that demand if it made sense within the structure of that school, meaning we wouldn't add a bubble classroom. But so families who arrive late do have fewer choices in terms of the schools that they can choose. And so the welcome centers and do help provide them with the options in terms of programs and services that are at each school for them to choose. We can't over-assign to those schools that are higher demand. We can't go over our class size limits. It's not an option we have. So we do see less choice for those families. The last thing I'll just add is the extra capacity that we have as a system right now is primarily a function of our hold harmless that we've done, but we have continued to work with schools to close capacity. This year, we are closing 23 classrooms across the districts. That is not probably as aggressive as you'd see in a typical weighted student funding year 2-3 years ago, but we've started to rebuild the thinking for school leaders to make those strategic choices. So those schools were closing the classroom capacity and thinking differently about how to use those resources within their school for inclusion, for multilingual learners, for equitable literacy, not just to keep that extra third grade that was not needed. And so that's something that we need to address. Other major capacity changes, and this answer has gotten way too long, but other major capacity changes need to happen at the district level. We need to drive that process. We need to be involved because it's hard for individual school communities. But and I'm quoting the superintendent here, that is not a facilities question. That is not a finance question. That is a community question. That's an organization question. And so that's the process that we need to lay out over the next year and why we can't move too quickly. We need to work with the community on that. And I'll pause there because I don't know if the superintendent wants to jump in or other members of the team because I've gave a long answer.
No, I think Nate, you did a great job talking about it. I think the exercise of closing classrooms was to begin to get leaders to really look at being able to deploy resources in a different way rather than to just do what they always do. I think with Central, it's very similar. We have to really think about a zero-sum budget and go through that practice and attach to each of the initiatives, which we will be doing going forward with the investment ones, attach to them the metrics for us to be able to report back to you whether something's making the difference and there's a return on investment or not. That's how we make those tough decisions about whether we continue to fund something or whether we stop funding it and we shift those resources to something that is going to be able to get better student outcomes. That process has not been done here in a while. And so we have to build the organizational muscle to do that. It means retraining Central to do that. It means retraining our schools to do that. And this budget is that first step of really asking the schools to look through their budgets And with Nate, as we move, Nate and David, as we move through Central, we are beginning to ask those questions and ask now as we get organizationally set, the deputies and then the chiefs to be able to do that level of scrutiny and work.
I always appreciate your candor on these things, particularly when we're just acknowledging where we have room to grow and where we can do better. I'll say this, and this is my final one for this round. We have hundreds of teacher vacancies. I am obsessed with this. And because if it was my own kid, superintendent, you'd be hearing from me. And so we have hundreds of teacher vacancies, and it's hard to reconcile having under-enrolled classrooms and classrooms without teachers. And the two things to me just like literally can't compute. And that is the urgency for me around right sizing the districts. Like, it's not a budget exercise. It's a student experience exercise. It's not like we're existing in a situation where we're fully staffed and schools have 3 or 4 kids or 11 kids in a classroom. You have kids, I would argue probably mostly kids who are Black and brown, who are sitting who are with long-term substitutes. And there are classrooms with certified teachers that are under-enrolled. And like, that's the urgency that I feel. And that's where you'll continue to get my questioning around our desire to continue expanding the system, including the workforce, as we think about building capacity, when like, I would argue there is existing capacity. We're just not putting kids in those seats and consolidating, as well as expanding central office, which I'll ask in my next round, because you and I both know the central office team is built from your internal workforce. And so you're just further cannibalizing the staffing, the staff that you have, creating greater vacancies if it's not a budget that is, we're growing and consolidating tomorrow, which I think we know the real consolidation of the system is a multi-year process. And that's where I'm just being honest with you. It's where I struggle seeing growth at the same time as we have to reconcile with getting certified teachers in front of kids.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think 2 things that I would kind of say. So I agree that the undercapacity, in the overcapacity in certain areas is mismatched with a classroom that might be down the hall. I do think that we've been doing some of that work this year as that issue has emerged, to be able at the school leader level to make those decisions. And so school classrooms sometimes are combined, or school leaders will shift resource to be able to make sure that there is that certified teacher in front of the student. That is in part this exercise that we began with the school leaders to get at exactly what you're talking about, which is rather than to have 2 half-empty classrooms, excuse me, combine them, that you have one, especially when you can't fill the second one, right? So we've been going through that exercise with the leaders. And that 23, right, represents kind of that change of thinking. At the central office, I think it's similar in with the ESSER piece, which is we are moving and asking to put to ESSER those things that we will need to make those hard decisions about, and making sure, as you saw in the budget presentation, the things that we know we definitely need and they're linked to the priorities to be on the hard budget. So, next year, in addition to the zero sum, it's going to be clearer what are the areas for which we have not gotten kind of that return on investment. And then we'll have a year's worth of data of the new investments to be able to make those decisions. So the budget process for Central will look really different for next year.
Thank you. I'm out of time right now. Thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Maida? You're still muted.
Sorry. back to what Dr. Alkins was saying. I'm just a little I'm just a little confused as to specifically, like, so if we're adding 38 ELL teachers, right? And we're trying to, would those be specifically in 25 schools, or because we're supposedly expanding it in 25 schools, right? So would that be in specifically 25 schools, or would it be like, I'm just confused.
Yeah.
I'd like clarification there.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. So the 36, the ESL teachers that we're proposing to add for next year, those are targeted to places where we're seeing schools serve a higher number of students with ELD levels 1 to 3 currently. Those schools may or may not be schools that are in the group of 25 that are going to a expanded bilingual or heritage program in the future, but is more connected with the needs of the kids they have in front of them today. Some of those issues we're seeing as students who are sort of walking in the door over the course of this year, and others are projected sort of continued growth in English learners over the course of the next year.
And just at this time, do we have an idea of how many schools will be switching to a dual language program / SEI program, or some? Do we have an idea of how many schools will be switching over the next 5-ish years, I guess?
We know we'll be expanding at least 25. And so we don't know how many for next year and which schools they will be at yet. So part of the additional budget investments are for planning grants, so that schools can actually work together as a team with family and community to make that decision. Because when we have a program like a dual language program, you need to ensure that you have stable enrollment. So we want to make sure it's a program that the community is completely committed to and wants to have, so that we can constantly have students in the program. And other schools make decisions that a transitional bilingual program is better for them, or a heritage language program is better for them and their community. So that's why I don't know what the schools are today, but we will go through that planning grant process.
Okay, thank you. I might come up with more questions, but I'm gonna let Ms. LaPera go.
Thank you. Ms. LaPera?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Mr. Mehta, for your questions. I actually had some similar ones, so I appreciate you bringing them up. To the point around the need for planning to expand some of our bilingual or multilingual programming, I want to get a better understanding of, in addition to the grants, like, how is the district really putting a stake in the ground to drive schools to provide this type of programming? Because when I think about how Boston has historically functioned, we already acknowledge that within our schools, we have a variety of different programs at each different school. And so if you're a student that needs X resource, you may have to go to a school all the way across town because that's the only school that has chosen to provide this type of programming. And so as I'm thinking about our budget process, I want to really understand, how are we, like, what is the district really saying with these investments, when right now I feel like we're saying we're going to do some planning, but ultimately it's opt-in for the school, specifically around when we're thinking about multilingual learners and access to native language instruction.
Thank you. That's a really critical point, in that We want our schools to embrace and make the best choices, but for multiple reasons, that may or may not happen automatically. So part of what the process is we always want to have a match of willingness and need. So part of what we'll be doing is looking at, specifically, we've been working with planning and analysis to look at where our students are, what language needs there are. So some of the proxy that we're using is the SEI language specific programs, because there are concentrations of students that clearly have a need in a single language, if you will. And so we begin with the data around those schools. So part of this is not just a, hey, raise your hand if you want to. We're looking at student data, where students are, and approaching those schools specifically to help plan and understand. And they need the support, right? They need to know that we are going to support them in recruitment of teachers and so on. So that is part of the process. The other thing that we're looking at, that we will be looking into, is when families come and they go to the Newcomer Learning Center, it's determined what their ELD, which is English Language Development level. I know school committee folks know that, but I just want to make sure if people hear why we keep saying ELD, that determines the type of supports that they need. They get a choice of programs based on what they need. And we want to really study what are the choices that families are making and understand why, so that we best know how to support around whether it's information that they need about bilingual programs or other programming needs to make the best option or choice. But what we're finding is some pattern also of families ending up selecting a general ed setting that requires ESL services rather than picking, say, an SEI language specific strand. So what we want to do is actually dive deeper into what the choices are that families are making and why, so that we can best know how to support and inform.
I appreciate that. And obviously there's trying to force a program down a community to adopt, I know is not necessarily the best way forward. I do worry about what messaging we send when we have such desperate programs within the district as a whole. One of the pieces that you mentioned is the need for this robust planning, and also really thinking about how the central office does support schools and being able to plan and implement for making any sort of programmatic transition. And so if I understood the slides correctly, there was a mention of a $750,000 ESSER investment around some of our diversity efforts within our staff. But I don't have any real understanding of what that looks like in terms of specific to bilingual and multilingual teachers and staff. And so as we're thinking about expansion in the next couple of years for 25 schools, what does the investment really look like in terms of pipeline development to be able to bring not just these 25 schools, but really the vision of native language instruction and better services for our multilingual learners throughout the district?
I just want to do a quick clarification on the slide where I talked about the 750K for recruitment, professional development, and pipeline work. That is current year ESSER spending. For FY24, those are moving to the general fund and will be sustained sort of teacher pipeline practices. In terms of your specific questions around language, diversity and recruitment, I'm not sure if that's, Linda, if you could talk about that. I'm not sure who the right person is to answer that question. I may have to come back to you.
Part of that is a partnership with our recruitment team in the Office of Human Capital. But we are working with organizations like MABE, or the Massachusetts Association of Bilingual Education, and other groups to actually help with getting the word out and recruiting. There's also a program, we've been having conversations in a program at Leslie to really develop more formal relationships so that it helps us with the recruitment piece. And also the training that can be provided to teachers. So there's a combination of things. And we also have been working with, and I'm not sure if folks from Human Capital are on, but we partner with them to really provide additional licensure, bilingual certification efforts, as well as ESL licensure, bilingual education, as well as the SCI endorsement. So we make sure that more of our teachers have that training. And we also have been engaging in work around paraprofessionals. We find that especially in the recruitment of bilingual staff, it's helpful to draw from our paraprofessionals who know our students well, speak the same native language, and with that additional coursework and certification, they can become teachers as well. So that's another aspect of the pipeline, if you will, that we're looking at.
No, I appreciate that. I think for me, I'm just trying to understand, like, what is the holistic investment, like, around these kind of different strategies? Like, how much are we, what dollars are we really putting towards making this a reality within our district?
Yeah, so I think, Chief Cooter, I think what we're looking for is the current investment in addition to the into the new investment that we're moving off of ESSER and over into this. And maybe while you're sort of looking at that, I think Chief Catchings is on, and I don't know, Chief Catchings, if you want to add anything else on the recruitment side, but I would also say that one of the things we're having conversations about that's been difficult for us is because of our DOJ agreement, we can't hire, like other districts can, any ESL teachers who are on waiver to be able to complete their internship with us. And that means, we'd be very competitive, and teachers would love to do that, to be able to complete their internship with us and then become a teacher with us permanently, but we can't do that. So one of the things that in our last conversation that we started talking about was what would be our ability to be able to do that, so that we open up our pool of candidates in positions that are highly competitive, like ESL, across the state. Obviously for Boston, we're not the only district that's had struggles with filling ESL and or finding paraprofessionals or other positions in which native language fits the Strand model. But we're trying to be as creative as possible and to look at where our barriers are to figure out how to be able to get around them. So as Dr. Chen talked about, I think on the recruitment side, it's not one solution, it's multiples. And we see this as a need that will grow, right? Especially as we start to, on the bilingual side, schools are planning for it, or for heritage programming, or dual language. And so we're going to need to continue to evolve our staff. And that means looking at parent pipeline, that means, looking at our para pipeline. And it also even means students and how our students and graduates can play a role in this, since we have such wonderful multilingual diversity. So I think this is an area that we are working and feel on the recruitment side so strongly about, that it's definitely multi-department that's working on this. So it's not just Linda's side, it's also OHC and Capital side, and Anna's side as well. And I don't know if Chief Catchings, if you want to add to that, or if I missed anything.
I don't have anything substantive to add at this time. I'll yield the community's time, but I think between Linda and Mary, we covered pretty much what's available to offer at this time. Besides, we are collaborating across teams to get this off the ground.
Thank you, I appreciate that. I'll just follow up with Mr. Cooter on the specific number amounts so that I get more clarity on that. Thank you.
Mr. O'Neill?
Thank you, Madam. Excuse me. Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Mr. Kuda, for the presentation and Superintendent for the remarks. I do have a couple of questions, but Mr. Kuda, first I want to say with regards to the enrollment slides that you had, I appreciate you taking the time to dive in more detail in why we do it. I say we, I mean the district, obviously, the way that you do. It was helpful to see, you know, the various times during the year and also the individual school example you gave. And I understand the nuance that you were pointing out, that we're also in weighted student funding and we're open enrollment. I'm still, to be honest with you, struggling to bridge that gap with, because of those pieces, you know, why we still do it that way versus, you know, has been pointed out, other districts in the state that, you know, may just keep a reserve back and build if the need is, particularly in light of, as the comments were tonight about, you know, they're underutilized classrooms. And here we have vacancies otherwise. So I think it's difficult for us to compare ourselves with other districts in the state because they don't have, most of them do not have the complexity of the programs, as you pointed out, Mr. Kuda, the complexity of the programs that we have to plan for and the open enrollment and the weighted student funding. I would be interested if you could dig a little bit further about other districts our size across the country and see, just to have a better comparison point about how they handle enrollment. I just think that would be helpful for folks who are struggling, as I am. I shouldn't talk about anyone else, I talk about myself. I'm struggling with the concept of, you know, planning for that absolute high water mark and what that impact would be, particularly knowing in the next couple of years, the ESSA funds are going to be dropping off. We're going to have some hard choices to make. So that's not a question for, that's something I'd love for you to talk to us later about. And I know you're doing some work, you've talked about it publicly, about rethinking how we're looking at funding anyway. So having examples, if we're really an outlier or are we, you know, more in line with some others, that type of thing. But what I wanted to get to today, since we're talking about Central District, I appreciate there was one slide who talked about the superintendent's priorities and all the reports we've seen. And as I said at the outset, I'm interested in some of the things coming out of those reports, the data report, the transportation report, the school safety report in particular, but also the special ed and the ELL, the special ed report. Budget is expressing priorities, right? Budget is, I think the chair has said many times, the budget shows us putting policy in action and priorities in action. So could you point out for me, Mr. Kuda, if you have it, you know, where specifically budget adjustments have been made based upon the reports, the findings, the strategy? Are we, and I know we had some points on it, but I'm thinking particularly around school safety, I'm thinking around transportation, and I particularly want to focus in on data. I do have a sense that we have a data deficit in our district, a tech debt, as they talk about, where districts, but also companies, quite frankly, have not made the investments to upgrade the systems over the years, particularly in lean years of budget. And it's coming back to haunt us. You know, when we think of data, there's three things. There's the professional development we do for the school leaders that have to, and teachers who in many cases have to input. But it's having the right systems and the modern systems and the systems that talk to each other and the systems that are intuitive. And I don't want us to put all the burden of this on our school leaders and our teachers. You know, and I'll give you one example, when we have the Aspen system that they were entering information about restraints, but then a separate DESE system. And I know DESE is very rigid in their systems, but can't we have something in the Aspen system that checks whether the DESE report also went in? If not, has a flag for our school leaders. It shouldn't always be on our school leaders. Oh, I have to do this, I have to do that. They're already overburdened. And I'm wondering if are we making an investment in professional development for folks on our system? But also, are we upgrading our systems? And do we have enough people internally in central office to actually get that data and have someone who's reviewing, oh, here's a restraint report in Aspen. Is it in the DESI system, as an example? So the investment, Mr. Cooter, on the infrastructure needed on these reports that we've been getting. And I'm sorry, Superintendent, looked like you were going to speak first.
Yeah, no, I'm gonna jump in for a second. And actually, Deputy DePina, I think can give some concrete examples on the ops side, specifically around kind of safety, transportation, where it's like very concrete. But like a good example would be the problem resolution system, where we've purchased and created a help desk, the staffing for that, the system for that. So we've put things in place that didn't exist previously, to your point, Member O'Neill, that were lacking both system and a technology data side to it. And so now as we're going through these reports, in each of them, and particularly on the ops side, you see the needs for these. And so that is something that I think Deputy DePina, do you want to just give a couple of concrete examples relative to school safety, relative to transportation, just even like something as simple as not simple, but the the ridership, just as examples where we're marrying kind of the technology and the data where it didn't exist prior.
Sure. The quick example that comes to my mind is the work we've done in our operations department, specifically in the facilities department. So as you may know, previously we did not have a work order management system that provided a lot of data about what requests were coming in, what work being performed. And now we have a new data system, and we do have a way to track and monitor that. And we do have dashboards that we now develop in operations that show us different data points around where we are with on-time performance, where we are with our food participation rates, where we are with different things of that nature. With the current planning that we're doing, we're engaging in some strategic planning work in our Office of Human Capital in our finance division. What we're doing is we're interviewing all staff, we're meeting with other school districts, we're meeting with private companies and businesses to understand what technologies they use, what systems and structures that they use. And then at the end of this review and data collection, we're going to further mine out what data systems we need to create or invest in. So though that's ongoing work that we're doing currently, that's going to help inform both the short-term work and the long-term work.
Yeah, there is definitely an enterprise issue where the volume of transactions that we do in particular departments needs an enterprise solution, and that doesn't exist. And so human capital is a good example of that. And so we need to really look at our systems that feed into the city system. And I think I spoke about that at a previous meeting. So that's an example. I think in the school safety side, certainly with emergency management planning, we are absolutely looking in this area. We're in active conversations, both with the council, their recommendations, and then, I think you're going to get some updates as a school committee on our immediate next steps in those areas. Transportation, there's multiple places where, to what Dan spoke about, being able to capture the data, looking at ridership, which right now DPS has always been sort of blind with. We need to go forward, use a technology solution that feeds back into a data system that will help TransDev and help us be able to be more efficient, much like we have with the routing software. So there's just almost every single area of the organization needs that uplift.
Thank you. And just as a follow-up question of that, because you talked about enterprise superintendent. So where do we stand in putting in place an enterprise solution to risk management and internal audit in particular, which was a policy that this body passed several years ago to put in place internal audit? And I know it's being worked on. I'm just unaware of where it stands now, because again, this is about trust and transparency, right? And people perform better when they know their work is going to be checked, plain and simple, right? You inspect. And so where do we stand on that process?
So, go ahead.
I apologize, Superintendent. Yeah, just briefly to say, in working with, we did hire a risk management position. We do have that person in place. And we've been working closely with her and our legal team to conduct a deep review of all of our systems and structures. So right now we're in the phase of, we've onboarded the person, and now we're doing the review of our systems and structures to determine what actions we need to take, very similar to external audits. We're now doing our internal audits with these staff members.
Okay, I'll follow up to learn more about that. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Are there other questions? Mr. Cardet Hernandez?
Yeah, I just have a question. Thank you again. I have two. One is just if you can help me with the rationale around, and if it's something that you want for the long-term, Superintendent. It was talked about that on central administration staff are key special education services. It sounds like some related services. I'd love to hear more about that, as well as occupational therapist. Is there a reason that's not existing at the school level? And then also just thinking of another layer, possibly of bureaucracy, are then the managers also not at the school levels? It's like all itinerant staff with managers that are on central budgets as well, instead of sort of schools managing the entirety of the special education programming and services?
Yeah, so through your chair, sometimes you ask the same questions I ask. Last year there was a shift with school psychs over to the schools, and there's lots of ripple effects when we move what had been centrally dispatched to the schools relative to even like pay and payroll. When you get down to the itinerant level, it becomes really complex, and it becomes complex because many of them are shared right across. So it's very hard for school leaders to do that kind of compatibility. It is something we are looking at, right, holistically in the org to sort of see what's possible. I think you see this often with, in general, like reading specialists too, right? Where, you know, a smaller school might require a portion, another school might require a full. But it is something we're looking at. And I think that in the reimagining funding, one of the things that we'll need to look at is sort of what does get dispatched centrally versus what gets dispatched at the school-based and controlled at the school-based. So I would say more to come on it. We don't right now. We're at the looking level on it.
Yeah, it's worth, I'm sure you're thinking about this too, like as we talk about inclusive practices, it then connects back to related services, because you have a student who's getting an hour a week of a pullout, or you could be embedding that support inside of a classroom. I think about that with speech or other related services that as a push-in model for some young people makes the most sense and allows them to stay integrated with their peers. But if it's an outside management, you lose that ability for programming.
That's right.
The last question I have here is there was just a slide, I think on slide 12, there was a new position, I think that's being added, equity specialists. And I'm curious what they do and what they do.
So Dr. Tavares or Chief Granson, I think either of you could take that.
Of course, I will invite Chief Grandson to give more details, but wonderful question, Mr. Cardet Hernandez. It's really thinking about how we fortify the regional model that's been mentioned throughout the presentation this evening, and thinking about creating this really this team with an expert lens around different components of what we need to fortify schools. And the equity specialist is really the person that's holding the most recent research, the most recent best practice around addressing those very specific equity needs at the school level. And I know that Dr. Grandson can share even further details.
Thank you, Dr. Torres, and thanks for the question. I'll just add that we're excited about this opportunity to expand in this way. We've been trying to, for the last few years, to really deepen our work in schools, and the need continues to surface. And so we're looking for, these dynamic individuals, some of whom we already have, a few of them on our team, two that we had this year, to be able to be cross-trained, right? No one is going to be a specialist and expert in every area of equity. But as Dr. Tavares mentioned, having a deep expertise in areas and then being able to cross-train and serve as a resource to one another across regions.
And just for further clarity, like, is it like a DEI role that's happening sort of centrally? And then I'm just like, are they dealing with problems of practice, or are they doing mindset training, or are they project managing? And if so, what project? And it's not to get into the details about a particular position, but I think as I can imagine a universe where someone sees this and, back to our earlier conversation of like, we know when we open central positions, it often means we're taking teachers out of classrooms and creating more vacancies. So like, just in terms of hierarchy of need, the dad and me hierarchy of need is always going to be kids with certified teachers in front of them, so like, how does this exist in it? And then like, what is the value add with respect that it means we may be losing teachers from the school to fill those roles, and how many roles are there?
Yeah. So there's a plan to be 9 roles to fit the 9 regions, but I think what you raise is a fair point in the struggle, the intention that we have, and I think it's, for us, the way we've looked at it is it's about balance, and so, which is why we dared not pull and advertise mid-year for this, but as school leaders are making decisions, as educators are in some cases already making decisions. It's an opportunity to look at it as a retention and ladder strategy for our district. As you mentioned earlier, that's how we feed a lot of the central office roles. And we definitely want individuals in those kinds of roles who are familiar with the district and familiar with our kids. But I hear you loud and clear. And to answer the first part of your question, we have not, over the last almost decade or so, had a sort of traditional DEI strategy in office and team, but instead, as sort of under the banner of our opportunity and achievement gaps policy, we focused on advancing equity, multilingual learners, students with disabilities, Black and Brown students, and other historically marginalized students. At the same time, when we look at post the murder of George Floyd, we've seen an increase in the need for things like affinity groups. And right now, some of that work has lived in our retention, cultivation, and diversity team. And so that's the beauty of having the ESOG division, where we have those folks who are able to collaborate and work off one another. But it would be a person who would be able to, if they aren't, for example, the DEI expert, but they are the racial equity expert, how do we get the resources to kids who need it most to them? Then they can pull on another colleague who might be a DEI expert and make sure that region or school gets the supports it needs.
Thank you. I'm 100% out of time. So thank you very much. And I appreciate it, Dr. Vincent.
Absolutely.
Are there other questions? Dr. Alkins?
Yes, thank you. Actually, this question I think is just more sort of thinking about the philosophy behind the organization that we see at central office. I think we've talked about it for as long as at least I've been on the committee. And so I'm actually curious from your perspective, Superintendent, only 5 months in, but where are some of the reorganization aspects that you're envisioning? And especially what are things that we should be paying attention to as we're thinking about this budget with respect to your ideas on the reorganization of central office?
Yeah, so we will be, through your chair, so we will be incorporating in going through the org chart so that you can see it. The plan is on the 15th. And I think what you'll see is that, and if you kind of lean through the reports, like all these audits and reports, kind of the lack of accountability of in different areas and bodies of the work. And then you kind of go back and you look at previous org charts, and what you kind of see is like huge amounts of work that fall under a few people, and areas such as special education, our multilingual learners, you know, multicultural, multilingual learners, home division, where they're kind of buried down in the organization, and there's no clear sense of accountability in the organization for the outcomes. And so what I'm going to attempt to do, having done a lot of processing with our team, is to make sure in the deputies that there's clear bodies of work, which they delineated tonight, as you heard them, for which they are responsible, right? They are responsible, but it's coherent. And so the areas that are that they're supervising are relative to that area and coherent. There is going to be a chief structure, and that chief structure is important because it gives the chief a particular body of work that is doable and for which they can be accountable. And when you look across the organization and you work together as a body, a decision-making body, you have the key areas present at the table to make the decisions. And that's not always been the case. And so what I kind of, in looking at past charts, and I think sometimes you see this in other districts too, right? But you can understand why ELL and special education didn't get the level of support and supervision it needed. And I say support as well. Or you can see why, you know, something like family and community engagement and advancement or equity was not a through line in the organization. Or you can see disconnects between the schools and the district, because there was the schools division and the districts division, and the two had no connection or connectivity. So what we're attempting to do in this budget and in the org chart is to bring a coherence to the organization, to remove single point of failures, for which we have them throughout the reports, and to bring a new sense of work that is doable and for which it is clear who is accountable in this next era of BPS. So that's kind of where I'm going to be coming from, and it's distributed. I do not believe the superintendent, everyone has to report to the superintendent, who is a high leader. I actually believe in distributed and shared leadership. And I also really believe in making sure that when we're making decisions as an organization, that we create a structure that allows good communication, clarity of what we're doing, why we're doing it, and plenty of opportunity for feedback, so that the important pieces of the organization get represented at each of those discussions.
Thank you for that. And actually, it's more of a comment to Dr. Granson. You know, I'd like to, if I can, I'd lend my knowledge and expertise in any lens that I can with respect to how you all are thinking about the equity specialist position in terms of knowledge of implementation, knowledge of just anything. You know, I'd love to be more involved in that process.
That's great. Thank you. Are there any additional questions from members? I have a question and a comment. First of all, I want to thank you all for this body of work that you've done, Nate and David. Personally, similar to what Mr. Cardet Hernandez said, I was a bit overwhelmed by the amount of it that in the short period of time that we received it in. So I personally don't feel I've been able to do it justice in terms of, you know, all of my questions and trying to connect the dots amongst what we were shown. But I'm going to go look at the places online where we can go deeper into different portions of the budget. But for example, I would love to see, you know, how much of our overall budget are we spending collectively on teacher supports, you know, or parent support, so that we can understand not only where we're investing, but how do we begin to evaluate those investments as we deepen those programs specifically. I was curious by your comment, Superintendent, about who we can't hire for special education or who we can't recruit. And then I wonder about who is already working in our system, and are they all as qualified as they should be to do the work? So do we have the highest quality of educators really doing our ELL work? You know, I wonder about that sometimes in some of the things I hear in passing about people's skills or lack of skills. And again, wondering what are our kids getting? And how are we sort of tightening up some of those issues as we begin to look at the budget and where we should be investing, you know, and how are we going to get, you know, I think we're all worried about the cliff or whatever that's coming, and how are we going to use this year to really tighten up where we are now? And so, and making some of the hard issues, I'm happy to hear that we've, you know, taken offline 23 classrooms that we don't need, but are continuing to invest the money in our current students, because that's where we should be making investments. So happy to hear more of that, because I really feel that supports our goal of better outcomes for kids. So for me, it's more sort of understanding more of the hard questions that we're asking, and, you know, and what we're going to be putting ourselves through to get to those answers, so that our budget is better aligned with need. So.
Yeah, that's, thank you, Chair. I mean, that's great. And to be honest with you, I think your suggestion about being able, there's so many different ways to present the spending,
Yes.
but that lens of what are we spending on student or directly on student service, what are on teacher support, I like that. And we can work to see what we can do with that too, because I think that would be, you know, informative for the public and for the committee. So appreciate that suggestion. And I think, you know, as we get into you know, this spring, I think we'll be beginning the conversations for next year in next year's budget. It's not, these are going to be conversations we won't be able and have the luxury to begin as we normally would on the normal budget timeline, because they are going to need community input. They're going to need school committee input. And so I think this is going to be a dialogue that we'll be having in the spring, certainly in our deep planning over the summer, and then carrying into the fall. So much more to come for sure, but these are conversations that we have to be committed to have.
Again, are there any more questions before we close out this evening?
It's not a question if everybody's done. It's a
Go ahead.
comment. It's sort of off topic of this. But someone was talking during public comment earlier, Ms. Reyes, and she was talking about security and about how the restorative justice and about how we should be doing more restorative justice instead of security. Well, she made that point while she was talking. And so I think that's a good idea. I mean, right, we're trying to do some restorative justice in the district, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, like, I think that's not a bad idea. I mean, we need to see the data of how effective restorative justice has been and will continue to be in this district, right? But then again, we also, the cameras, it wouldn't be the worst idea, in my opinion, right? If we were to minimize the investment we have in the cameras. I know that can't be done overnight, so but like, I'm just saying stuff. Like, I think doing that, it's a solid idea. I don't know. You know, I'm spitballing here, but like,
So Diego, let me just jump in for a second. So I think one thing I can clarify is different pots of money pay for different things. And so I think CFO Kudo, can you just explain on the cameras what that pot of money is?
Yeah, I think when we present the budget here, we're presenting both the operating budget. We provide a preview of our external fund budget. Sometimes external funds have specific rules on how to spend them. And the third pot of money, I think the superintendent's referring to, is our capital budget. The capital budget is funding that we get it from the city, where we borrow money to be able to make long-term investments. And those have to be in physical goods that last a certain period of time, usually 5 to 10 years at least for a capital investment to qualify. So the security, some of the security upgrades that we're making are capital budget investments. So we could make trade-offs as a district and as a city about, we want security cameras or security upgrades versus other facilities upgrades, but we couldn't make the trade-off between the security cameras and restorative justice personnel, people, and staff. But I do think I am clearly hearing that restorative justice is a priority for us to think about, priority for students for us to think about. And we could take that back, because this is our opportunity to think about what are the trade-offs that we should be making differently from what we've presented in our budget and what represents the school committee's values and your values as representing the students here at the hearing tonight.
That's right. And I would just say, Diego, let me just add one more thing. I would say that we are using the Council of Great City Schools report as one of the guides for looking at some of the security pieces, as well as school leaders and their input of their buildings when it comes to things like the cameras. The other thing about the restorative justice is we didn't get to talk about it tonight, but we're actually doing this is an example of shifting some central resources to be able to really expand restorative justice practice and training as part of the networks. So we didn't talk about it tonight because we were really talking about investments, but that is something that we are actively working on and will happen for next year.
okay, that's good to hear. Okay. How do I continue to phrase? How do I phrase this? Oh God, this is. I have something I'm gonna say. I don't know how to phrase it. We'll do it in a not later.
Are you okay for now? You can take your
Yeah.
time. You have something you want to say? Take your time. Take your time.
Are there ways right? The 30 million is towards security, not just cameras, right?
The 30 million, the 30 million is over 5 years, and that is on the camera pieces.
Okay, Okay. All right. That was just a clarification. That's all I needed. Talk later.
All right, sounds good, Diego.
Okay. Okay. Are there any other questions, comments before we close out this evening? Oh, okay, there are. Okay. Ms. Rivera?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I didn't realize I was going to be racing member Cardette Hernandez for a word. But I want to appreciate member Meta for just reminding us of, you know, what students have on their mind. And especially in this space that is full of adults who are used to being, you know, framing our questions and saying our comments. I just really appreciate your vulnerability and your comments and your contributions. So thank you. And always take all the time that you need to engage with us. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Mr. Cardette Hernandez.
Miss Lopera stole my words, but I'll say it too because it matters. Diego, like one, your value is so great here, and we're just so thankful to have you, and also a really good reminder of what's on your mind. And I know you know this, but like we all have this incredible power, you included, to influence what this budget looks like when it comes back to us in a few weeks. And so take your time in life because the questions are always really good. And I ask a lot of questions, and I was about to ask the question about restorative justice, and I made the decision not to ask why it wasn't a further investment. And so I'm really happy that you did. So yeah, just thank you because it matters, and this is our chance to influence it. So like, do your thing. I will just ask for our next presentation. I know, Superintendent, you just mentioned there are places where there are resources being redeployed. It might be really helpful. I think maybe you're getting the sense that we're looking to understand new investments in addition to how you're redeploying existing resources across the organization to meet your priorities. And so like that might be a really helpful way for us to make further meeting of the budget in its totality and not just the budget as new needs.
Yep, no, totally makes sense. And we can definitely give you some information around examples of that and what's happening. I think next year you will see kind of a before and an after. Because that's really what zero-sum budgeting is. So and I echo on Mr. Mehta. You do a great job, Diego.
Yep, absolutely. Thank you. Okay. I'll ask it again. Are there any further questions before we close out this evening? Okay. Thank you all. And thank you again to all that testified this evening. I want to remind everyone that all budget documents are available online at bostonpublicschools.org/budget. And you can email your comments to budget@bostonpublicschools.org, as well as to the school committee. Our final remote budget hearing will take place on Wednesday, March 15th at 5 p.m. prior to the school committee meeting that same evening. If there's nothing further, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. Is there any discussion or objection to the motion? Ms. Sullivan, will you please call the roll?
Dr. Alkins,
Yes.
Mr. Cardette Hernandez,
Yes.
Ms. Lopera,
Yes.
Ms. Polanco Garcia,
Yes.
Ms. Tran, Mr. O'Neill,
Yes.
Ms. Robinson.
Yes.
It's unanimous. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Sullivan, and thank you all. And this hearing is adjourned. Good night.
Thank you, everyone.
Good night, all.